Chapter 1. The Discovery. Harry Potter stood in the middle of Diagon Alley and tried to convince himself he belonged there. The cobblestones beneath his feet were warm from the August sun, and the familiar chaos of wizards bustling between shops should have felt like coming home after 2 months trapped at Privet Drive. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, he found himself studying the faces around him, wondering how many were staring at his scar when they thought he wasn't looking, how many were whispering about the boy who lived behind their hands. He was almost more afraid that people would notice him than that they wouldn't. The attention still felt strange, unwelcome, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. At the Dursleys, he'd been nobody, worse than nobody, really, a burden to be hidden away. Here, he was somebody, and he wasn't entirely sure which felt worse. "Harry, come on!" Ginny Weasley called from outside Flourish and Blots, her voice bright with excitement. "They're about to start." Mrs. Weasley was already herding her family toward the bookshop, where a crowd had gathered around a table laden with gleaming hardcover books. Gilderoy Lockhart's impossibly white smile beamed from every cover, his golden hair catching the light just so. Harry trudged after the Weasleys, feeling that familiar weight settle in his chest, the feeling that he was pretending to be someone he wasn't, playing at being part of a family that wasn't quite his. "Honestly," Hermione muttered beside him, clutching her copy of Hogwarts, a history like a shield. "I can't believe they're making such a fuss over him. Half the things in his books are probably made up." Ron snorted. "More than half, if you ask me. No way he's actually done all that stuff." Harry nodded absently, but he wasn't really listening. His attention had caught on something else entirely. The way Ginny kept glancing back at him with those wide brown eyes, then looking away quickly when she realized he'd noticed. The way she'd gone pink around the ears when she'd called his name. He felt a stab of something that might have been guilt or maybe just exhaustion. He didn't want to be looked at like that, like he was something special, something worth being nervous about. The crowd around Lockhart's table was 3 deep now, mostly middle-aged witches clutching his books to their chests and sighing dreamily. Harry found himself pressed between Mrs. Weasley and a woman in lime-green robes who kept stepping on his feet in her eagerness to get closer to the author. "Look at him," the woman whispered to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice. "So young, and already so accomplished. They say he's writing a book about defeating dark creatures before you're even out of school." Harry felt his stomach twist. He wanted to tell her that defeating dark creatures wasn't an accomplishment to aspire to, that it mostly involved being terrified and getting very, very lucky, but he'd learned that people didn't want to hear that. They wanted the story, not the truth. Lockhart looked up from signing a book, and his eyes found Harry in the crowd. His smile somehow managed to become even brighter, more artificial, like someone had cast a cheering charm on a shop window display. "Well, well," Lockhart said, his voice carrying easily over the murmur of the crowd. "Harry Potter, how absolutely delightful." The crowd turned as one to stare at Harry, and he felt heat creep up his neck. This was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, could practically hear the wheels turning in their heads. There's the boy who lived. There's the one who defeated you-know-who. There's the famous one. "Come here, Harry," Lockhart commanded, gesturing grandly. "Let me get a picture with you. Think of the publicity." Harry's feet seemed to move of their own accord, carrying him forward through the crowd. He could feel the Weasleys watching him, could sense Hermione's disapproval and Ron's second-hand embarrassment. Lockhart's hand landed on his shoulder with a grip that was just a little too tight, fingers digging in through his t-shirt. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lockhart announced to the crowd, "when I heard that Harry Potter was shopping here today, I simply had to take the opportunity to present him with my entire collected works, absolutely free of charge." A wizard with a camera appeared as if by magic, flashbulb already popping. Harry blinked against the sudden brightness, feeling trapped and small despite being the center of attention. Or maybe because of it. Lockhart was talking again, saying something about young heroes and the importance of good literature. But Harry's mind had gone somewhere else entirely. He was thinking about his cupboard at the Dursleys, about the blessed darkness and quiet of being forgotten. He was thinking about how simple it had been when no one expected anything from him except to stay out of the way. He'd thought he'd hated it then. But standing here with Lockhart's hand on his shoulder and flashbulbs going off in his face, he found himself almost nostalgic for invisibility. The crowd was applauding now, though Harry wasn't sure what for. Lockhart was piling books into his arms, heavy, expensive-looking things with the author's face grinning up from every cover. Harry's arms were beginning to ache from the weight when he heard a voice cut through the crowd like a knife. "Bet you loved that, didn't you, Potter?" Harry looked up to see Draco Malfoy pushing through the crowd, his pale face twisted with the familiar sneer Harry had grown so tired of seeing. Behind him came his father, Lucius Malfoy, moving with that particular aristocratic grace that somehow managed to make everyone else look common by comparison. "Famous Harry Potter," Draco continued, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "Can't even go to a bookshop without making the front page." "Leave him alone," Ginny said suddenly, stepping forward with her chin raised defiantly. Her face was red, but her voice was steady. He didn't ask for any of this. Lucius Malfoy's cold grey eyes fixed on Ginny with mild interest, like she was some curious species of insect. "Ah, young Miss Weasley. Still defending lost causes, I see." His gaze shifted to Harry, and Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. Though I suppose Potter hardly needs defending. After all, he's quite capable of handling himself, isn't he? The great celebrity. Arthur Weasley had appeared at Ginny's shoulder, his face flushed with anger. "That's enough, Malfoy. We're here to buy school books, not to listen to your opinions." "Oh, I think my opinions are perfectly relevant," Lucius replied smoothly. "After all, when the famous Harry Potter makes such a spectacle of himself, it becomes everyone's business, doesn't it?" Harry wanted to say something, wanted to tell them all that he hadn't asked for any of this, that he'd been perfectly happy being nobody, but his throat felt tight and the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just stood there, holding Lockhart's books and feeling like an exhibit in a museum. Arthur stepped closer to Lucius, and Harry could see the tension in his shoulders. "Watch yourself, Malfoy. I won't have you upsetting my family." "Your family?" Lucius laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "I wasn't aware Potter had become a Weasley, though I suppose charity cases do have a way of collecting with your kind." That was apparently the last straw. Arthur lunged forward, and suddenly everything was chaos. Books scattered across the floor as the two men grappled, shouting and cursing. Mrs. Weasley was shrieking something about public decency. Lockhart was calling for order, and the crowd was either pressing forward to get a better look or backing away in alarm. Harry found himself stumbling backward, Lockhart's books tumbling from his arms. He caught one, some nonsense about household pests, but the rest crashed to the ground and scattered among the chaos. In the confusion, he saw Ginny's cauldron tip over, her new school books spilling across the floor. He dropped to his knees to help gather them up, grateful for something to do with his hands that wasn't standing there being stared at. Most of Ginny's books were the same ones he'd need, standard first-year texts that he remembered from his own first year. But as he reached for a copy of the Standard Book of Spells, his fingers closed around something else, entirely. A small black diary with a worn leather cover. It was unremarkable looking, the kind of thing you might find in any Muggle stationery store, but something about it made him pause. The diary felt warm in his hands, warmer than it should have been, sitting on the cool stone floor. For a moment, he thought he felt something like a pulse beneath his fingers, as if the book had a heartbeat of its own. Then Arthur and Lucius separated with a final shove, both of them breathing hard and glaring at each other across the scattered books. "Come, Draco," Lucius said coldly, smoothing down his robes with hands that barely trembled. I see that associating with muggles has affected the Weasleys' manners even more than I thought." He turned on his heel and swept away, Draco following with one last smirk in Harry's direction. The crowd began to disperse, the excitement over, leaving the Weasleys and Harry to clean up the mess. "I'm so sorry," Harry said, scrambling to collect the last of the scattered books. He still had the diary in one hand, and something about it made him reluctant to put it down. "I should have just left when I saw them coming." "Don't be ridiculous," Mrs. Weasley said firmly, though her face was still pink with embarrassment. "None of this was your fault. Lucius Malfoy is a vile man, and he'd have found some excuse to start trouble no matter what." Ginny was looking around frantically, patting down her robes and checking the floor. "Has anyone seen my diary? I know I packed it with my books, but I can't find it anywhere." Harry looked down at the small black book in his hand. "Is this it?" he asked, holding it up. Ginny's face went bright red. "Oh no," she said, reaching for it quickly. "You don't want to touch that. It's nothing really. Just a diary." But as she reached for it, Harry found himself pulling his hand back slightly. He couldn't have said why. The diary felt important somehow, like something he was meant to have. "Actually," he heard himself saying, "I think this one might be mine. I thought I'd lost it in the confusion." Ginny stared at him, her mouth slightly open. "But I just said it was mine." "Are you sure?" Harry asked, and he was surprised by how easily the lie came. "They all look the same, don't they? Maybe you grabbed one of mine by mistake." There was a long moment of silence. Ginny looked like she wanted to argue, but something in Harry's expression must have stopped her. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. "I suppose they do all look the same," she said quietly. "I must have been mistaken." Harry felt a stab of guilt at the disappointment in her voice, but it was overwhelmed by something else, a strange sense of rightness, as if the diary belonged in his hands. He slipped it into his bag quickly before anyone could ask more questions. The rest of the shopping trip passed in a blur of uncomfortable silence. Mrs. Weasley kept shooting worried glances at Arthur, who was still muttering under his breath about Lucius Malfoy. Ron and Hermione flanked Harry protectively, but he could feel their concern like a weight on his shoulders. Even Ginny seemed subdued, though she kept glancing at Harry's bag when she thought he wasn't looking. By the time they returned to the burrow, Harry's head was pounding, and all he wanted was to be alone. The Weasley house felt too bright, too loud, too full of people who cared about him and expected him to be grateful for it. He managed to escape to Ron's room while the family debated the events of the day over dinner, claiming he had a headache and wasn't hungry. Ron's room was cramped but mercifully quiet. Harry sat on his camp bed and pulled the diary from his bag, turning it over in his hands. It was even more unremarkable than he'd first thought, just a plain black cover with no title or decoration. When he opened it, the pages were completely blank, yellowed slightly with age but empty of any writing. He should give it back to Ginny. He knew that. She'd said it was hers, and he'd basically stolen it from her. But something about the diary made him reluctant to let it go. It felt like the first thing in months that was truly his, something that had chosen him rather than being forced on him by circumstances or expectations. Harry found a quill in Ron's desk and sat down with the diary open in front of him. For a long moment, he just stared at the blank page, unsure what to write. What did you say to an empty book? What was the point of writing when no one would ever read it? But maybe that was the point. Maybe it would be nice to have something that was just his, something he could tell the truth to without worrying about how it would sound or whether it would disappoint anyone. Finally, he dipped the quill in ink and wrote, "My name is Harry Potter." The words sat there on the page, looking stark and somehow vulnerable in the dim light of Ron's room. Harry waited, though he wasn't sure what for. Nothing happened. The words didn't disappear or change or do anything magical at all. They just sat there, patient and quiet. He was about to close the diary and put it away when something made him look again. The ink from his words was fading, sinking into the page as if the paper were absorbing it. As he watched, new words began to appear in a different handwriting, elegant, flowing script that looked nothing like his own messy scrawl. "Hello, Harry Potter. My name is Tom Marvolo Riddle." Harry's hand jerked, sending a splatter of ink across the page. But as soon as the drops hit the paper, they were absorbed just like his words had been, leaving the page clean except for Tom's introduction. "I'm sorry," Harry wrote quickly. "I didn't mean to get ink on you." "No harm done," came the reply, the words appearing as quickly as if someone were writing them right beside him. "I take it you found my diary by accident." "I think so," Harry admitted. "It got mixed up with some other books. I'm sorry for reading it. I can give it back if you want." "Oh, I don't mind at all," Tom wrote, and somehow Harry could almost hear warmth in the elegant script. "It's been quite some time since anyone has written in me. I was beginning to think I'd been forgotten entirely." Harry stared at the words, his heart beating faster. A diary that could write back. A diary that contained someone named Tom Marvolo Riddle, who seemed kind and lonely and happy to have someone to talk to. It was the strangest thing that had happened to him since he'd learned he was a wizard, and that was saying something. "How long have you been in there?" he wrote. 50 years, give or take," came the reply. "I was a student at Hogwarts when I was preserved in these pages. 6th year, if I remember correctly." Hogwarts? Harry's quill moved almost without his conscious thought. "I go to Hogwarts. Well, I will be going back in a few weeks. I'll be starting my 2nd year. How wonderful." The response came quickly, almost eagerly. "It's been so long since I've had news of the school. Tell me, is it much the same as it was in my day?" Harry found himself smiling for the first time all day. Here was someone who wanted to hear about Hogwarts, who was interested in his experiences, not because of who he was supposed to be, but because they genuinely cared. He began to write, telling Tom about the Great Hall and the moving staircases, about Quidditch and the house system, and his professors. Tom responded with questions and observations, sharing memories of his own time at school that made Harry laugh. "Professor Slughorn was my potions master," Tom wrote, "a bit obsessed with collecting famous students, but kind enough in his way." "Who teaches potions now?" "Professor Snape," Harry replied. Then hesitated. How much should he share with this stranger? But something about Tom's writing made him feel safe, made him want to be honest. "He hates me. I'm not sure why, but he's made it clear from the first day that he thinks I'm arrogant and stupid." "I'm sure that's not true," Tom wrote, and Harry felt a warm glow in his chest at the gentle reassurance. Some professors can be difficult, especially if they have their own troubled histories. Perhaps Professor Snape simply doesn't know how to connect with students. It was such a reasonable, understanding response that Harry felt some of the tension he'd been carrying for months begin to ease. Here was someone who didn't immediately take sides or make assumptions, who was willing to consider that maybe both he and Snape were just trying their best in a difficult situation. "You're probably right," Harry wrote. "I never thought about it that way. Sometimes an outside perspective can be helpful," Tom replied. "You mentioned this is your 2nd year. How was your first? I imagine it must be quite an adjustment, coming to Hogwarts." And suddenly Harry found himself pouring out everything. The terror and confusion of his first year, the business with the Philosopher's Stone, his worry that he'd never really fit in anywhere. Tom listened, if you could call it listening when someone was reading your words, without judgment, asking thoughtful questions and offering gentle encouragement. He seemed genuinely interested in Harry's experiences, not because they were dramatic or newsworthy, but because they mattered to Harry. "It sounds like you've had quite an adventure," Tom wrote when Harry finally ran out of things to say. "And you handled it all remarkably well, from what you've told me. I don't feel like I handled anything well," Harry admitted. Most of the time I was just scared and trying not to get anyone else hurt. That's exactly what I mean, Tom replied. You put others' safety before your own, even when you were frightened. That takes real courage. Harry stared at the words, feeling something loosen in his chest. When Tom put it like that, it almost sounded like something to be proud of rather than ashamed of. Thank you, he wrote simply. For what? For listening. For not making me feel like I'm crazy or ungrateful. Everyone else seems to think I should be thrilled about everything that's happened to me, and I feel guilty that I'm not. Oh, Harry, Tom wrote, and somehow the elegant script managed to convey deep sympathy. Of course you're not thrilled. You're 12 years old, and you've been thrust into situations no child should have to face. Anyone would struggle with that. Harry felt his throat tighten. He'd been carrying this guilt for so long, the feeling that he was disappointing everyone by not being happier, braver, more grateful for the life he'd been given. But Tom understood. Tom didn't expect him to be anything other than what he was. I've never told anyone that before, Harry wrote. I'm honored that you told me, came the reply. Sometimes we need someone who stands outside our circumstances to remind us that our feelings are valid. They wrote back and forth until Harry's hand cramped and his eyes burned with exhaustion. Tom was endlessly patient, asking about Harry's life at the Dursleys, his friendships with Ron and Hermione, his worries about the upcoming school year. He offered advice that was always thoughtful and kind, never presumptuous or condescending. I should probably get some sleep, Harry finally wrote, though he was reluctant to close the diary and end the conversation. Of course, Tom replied. Thank you for such a lovely evening, Harry. It's been wonderful to have someone to talk to again. Can I write to you again tomorrow? I would like that very much. Harry closed the diary and slipped it under his pillow, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. For the first time since the end of first year, he had someone to talk to who understood him, someone who didn't expect him to be anything other than himself, someone who thought his feelings mattered and his struggles were real. Downstairs, he could hear the Weasley family settling in for the night. Mrs. Weasley chivying the twins up to bed, Mr. Weasley still muttering about Lucius Malfoy, Ginny asking if anyone had seen her diary. Harry felt a brief stab of guilt about the diary, but it was overwhelmed by gratitude for this unexpected gift. Tom Marvolo Riddle felt like the first real friend he'd ever had who was truly his alone, not shared with Ron or Hermione, not part of his complicated relationship with the Weasley family, not coloured by expectations about who Harry Potter was supposed to be. Just someone who cared about Harry for Harry's sake, who wanted to know what he thought and how he felt. As Harry drifted off to sleep, he was already looking forward to their next conversation, to having someone who understood what it was like to feel lost and uncertain and grateful for a gentle word. For the first time in weeks, he fell asleep smiling, the diary warm and comforting beneath his pillow, like a secret promise that he would never have to feel quite so alone again. Chapter 2. A Perfect Confidant. The train journey back to Hogwarts should have felt like coming home, but Harry found himself pressed against the window of their compartment, watching the countryside blur past and trying to ignore the familiar weight of expectation settling on his shoulders like a poorly fitted cloak. Ron was arguing with Hermione about something involving Gilderoy Lockhart's teaching credentials, their voices a comfortable buzz that he usually found soothing. Today, though, it felt distant, like hearing conversation through a wall. The diary was tucked safely in his trunk, hidden beneath his robes where no one would think to look for it. He'd brought it along, despite a nagging voice in the back of his mind that whispered he was being stupid, that he should have left it at the Burrow, or better yet, given it back to Ginny like he'd originally planned. But the thought of being at Hogwarts for months without Tom to talk to had made his chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to panic. "Harry," Hermione's voice cut through his thoughts. "Are you all right? You've been very quiet." He turned from the window to find both his friends watching him with expressions of concern that made him want to squirm. They'd been doing that a lot lately, looking at him like he was a puzzle they couldn't quite solve, like he was somehow different from the person they'd expected him to be. He supposed he was. Just tired, he said, which wasn't entirely a lie. He'd been staying up late every night talking to Tom, and the conversations had a way of leaving him both energized and drained. It's been a long summer, Ron snorted. Tell me about it. Mum had us denoming the garden every other day. I think she was taking out her frustration about Dad's hearing at work. At least your family wants you around, Harry said, before he could stop himself. The words came out sharper than he'd intended, and he saw Ron's face fall slightly. I didn't mean, Ron started, but Harry waved him off. No, it's fine. Sorry, I'm just not looking forward to Defense Against the Dark Arts with Lockhart. It was a transparent attempt to change the subject, but Hermione latched onto it with evident relief. He can't be that bad, surely. His books are fascinating, and he's done so many incredible things. Have you actually read his books, or just looked at his picture? Ron asked, with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was still watching Harry with that careful expression, as if he were afraid Harry might snap at him again. Harry felt a stab of guilt. These were his best friends, and they were trying to include him, trying to make him feel better. The fact that their concern felt suffocating rather than comforting wasn't their fault. It was his problem, his inability to be grateful for what he had instead of always wanting something else. The rest of the journey passed in stilted conversation and long silences. By the time they reached Hogwarts, Harry's head was pounding, and all he wanted was to be alone with the diary. The Sorting Hat song washed over him without really registering, and the sorting itself seemed to take forever. When the first years were finally seated, and Dumbledore began his usual start-of-term announcements, Harry found his attention wandering to the staff table, where Gilderoy Lockhart was beaming at the students like he was posing for a photograph. I'm pleased to announce, Dumbledore was saying, his voice carrying easily through the Great Hall, that this year's Defense Against the Dark Arts position will be filled by Gilderoy Lockhart, Order of Merlin, 3rd class, honorary member of the Dark Force Defense League, and 5-time winner of Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award. Lockhart stood and waved at the students as if they were an audience at one of his book signings. A few of the girls at the Hufflepuff table actually giggled and waved back. Harry felt his stomach turn slightly. Blimey, Ron muttered under his breath. He really thinks he's something special, doesn't he? Harry nodded absently, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Tom's gentle questions the night before, about how it had felt to have someone really listen to his concerns without immediately trying to fix them or tell him he was being ungrateful. Tom had asked about his professors, about whether Harry felt supported by the adults in his life, and Harry had found himself admitting things he'd never said out loud before. Professor Dumbledore seems kind, Tom had written after Harry described the headmaster. But sometimes the kindest people are the ones who think they know what's best for us, better than we do ourselves. At the time, Harry had dismissed it as Tom being overly cynical. Now, watching Dumbledore's twinkling eyes as he surveyed the Great Hall with obvious satisfaction, Harry found himself wondering if there was something to what Tom had said. How much choice had Harry really had in any of the major decisions of his life? The Dursleys, Hogwarts, even his friends. Everything had been chosen for him, arranged by adults who were certain they knew what was best. The feast began, and Harry forced himself to eat, though the food tasted like sawdust in his mouth. Conversation flowed around him. Ron complaining about his new dress robes, Hermione speculating about their new classes, the other Gryffindors gossiping about various summer adventures. Harry nodded and made appropriate noises, but he felt strangely detached from it all, as if he were watching the scene from a great distance. By the time they made their way up to Gryffindor Tower, Harry's exhaustion felt bone-deep. He mumbled something about needing to unpack and escaped to the dormitory before Ron or Hermione could suggest they sit by the fire and catch up properly. The other boys in their year were still downstairs, which meant he had the room to himself for at least a little while. Harry pulled the diary from his trunk and settled on his bed with it, feeling some of the tension in his shoulders ease just from holding it. There was something comforting about the worn leather cover, about knowing that Tom was there, waiting to listen to whatever Harry needed to say. "I'm back at school," he wrote, his handwriting messier than usual in his eagerness to reconnect. "How wonderful," came the immediate reply, the elegant script appearing as if Tom had been sitting there waiting for him. "I've been thinking about you all day, wondering how the journey went. Are you settling in well?" The simple question unlocked something in Harry's chest, and suddenly he was writing furiously, pouring out everything he'd been feeling, but couldn't say to Ron and Hermione. The pressure of being back in the public eye, the weight of everyone's expectations, the way he felt like he was performing the role of Harry Potter rather than actually living his life. "It sounds exhausting," Tom wrote when Harry finally ran out of words. "To be so young and carry so much responsibility, so much scrutiny. I can't imagine how difficult that must be. Everyone else thinks I should be grateful," Harry wrote back. "And I am, really. It's just... sometimes I feel like I'm drowning, and when I try to tell people that, they just remind me how lucky I am to be alive. Oh, Harry." The words seemed to pulse on the page with sympathy. "Of course you feel that way. You're being asked to be grateful for trauma, to celebrate the worst night of your life simply because you survived it. That's incredibly unfair." Harry stared at the words, feeling something tight in his chest begin to loosen. Tom understood. Tom didn't think he was being ungrateful or dramatic. Tom saw how hard this was, and acknowledged that it was hard, without immediately trying to convince Harry that it could be worse. "I've never thought about it that way," Harry wrote. "Most people don't," Tom replied. "They're so dazzled by the idea of surviving something extraordinary that they forget survival comes with its own costs. Tell me, what was it like? Living with your relatives after such a terrible loss?" Harry hesitated. He'd never told anyone the full truth about the Dursleys, not even Ron and Hermione. They knew he didn't get along with his relatives, that he was glad to be at Hogwarts, but they didn't know about the cupboard under the stairs, or the bars on his window, or the way Uncle Vernon's face would turn purple when Harry accidentally made something magical happen. But Tom was different. Tom was patient and understanding, and he lived in a diary where Harry's secrets would be safe. More than that, Tom seemed to genuinely care about Harry as a person, not as a symbol or a story. "They hated me," Harry wrote slowly. "I don't think they ever wanted me. But after my parents died, they were stuck with me. They told me my parents died in a car crash because they were drunk, that they were worthless, that I was worthless too. They locked me in a cupboard and told me to be grateful they didn't just leave me on the street." The words looked stark and ugly on the page, but also somehow lighter than they'd felt carrying them around in his head. Tom's response took longer than usual, and when it came, the script seemed somehow darker, more intense. "Harry, that's not just cruelty. That's abuse. You were a child who had lost everything, and instead of comfort and love, they gave you more pain. I'm so sorry." "They weren't that bad," Harry wrote quickly, though even as he formed the words they felt wrong. "I mean, they fed me and gave me a place to live, and they were probably just scared of magic." "I can understand that." "Can you?" Tom wrote back, and somehow the simple question made Harry pause. "You were a child, Harry, a child who had lost his parents in the most traumatic way possible. Even if they were scared of magic, even if they didn't understand your world, you deserved kindness. You deserved love. The fact that you can make excuses for their treatment of you shows exactly how badly they damaged your sense of what you deserve." Harry stared at the words, feeling something shift inside him like a foundation stone settling into a new position. He'd spent so long telling himself that the Dursleys' treatment wasn't that bad, that other people had it worse, that he should be grateful they hadn't actually thrown him out on the street. But Tom was right. He had been a child. He had deserved better. I never thought about it that way, Harry admitted. Of course you didn't. When abuse begins in childhood, it shapes how we see ourselves and what we think we deserve. But you're safe now, Harry. You're at Hogwarts, away from them, and you have the chance to discover who you really are when you're not walking on eggshells. Sometimes I'm not sure who that is, Harry wrote. Everyone expects me to be this brave, noble person because of what happened when I was a baby. But most of the time I just feel scared and confused and angry. That sounds perfectly human to me, Tom replied, and far more honest than the facade you feel pressured to maintain. Tell me, do you feel like you can be honest with your friends about these feelings? Harry considered this. Ron and Hermione were wonderful, loyal friends, but they definitely had expectations about who Harry was supposed to be. Ron looked up to him, wanted him to be brave and confident and sure of himself. Hermione worried about him, but she also had very firm ideas about what was healthy and normal, and Harry's darker thoughts didn't always fit into those categories. Not really, he admitted. They care about me, but they also have this idea of who I'm supposed to be. If I told them I sometimes hate being famous, or that I resent having to be grateful all the time, they'd probably think I was being ungrateful. It sounds lonely, Tom wrote, to have people who care about you, but feel like you can't show them your true self. It is, Harry replied, surprised by how relieved he felt to admit it. It's very lonely. They wrote back and forth for what felt like hours, Tom asking gentle questions that helped Harry articulate feelings he'd barely acknowledged to himself. The abuse at the Dursleys, the pressure of being famous, the way everyone seemed to want a piece of him, but no one seemed interested in who he actually was underneath the legend. You know, Tom wrote eventually, it's interesting that you mention feeling like adults make decisions for you without consulting what you actually want. What do you mean? Well, you were placed with the Dursleys without anyone asking if you felt safe there. You were brought to Hogwarts and sorted into Gryffindor without much input about what you wanted. Even your friendships seem to have been somewhat arranged by circumstances rather than genuine choice. Harry frowned, his quill hovering over the page. I chose Ron and Hermione. They're my best friends. Of course, Tom replied quickly. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. But think about it. You met them on your very first day, when you were overwhelmed and knew nothing about the wizarding world. Ron was the first person your age to be kind to you on the train, and Hermione was the first person to make you feel clever and capable. Is it possible that you latched onto them because they were there when you needed someone, rather than because they're truly compatible with who you are? The suggestion should have made Harry angry, defensive of his friends. Instead, it made him think. Ron was loyal and brave and funny, but he was also sometimes thoughtless, and his awe of Harry's fame could be uncomfortable. Hermione was brilliant and caring, but she could be bossy and judgmental, and she had very fixed ideas about what was right and wrong that didn't always leave room for complexity. I love them, Harry wrote, though the words felt somehow uncertain. I'm sure you do, Tom replied, but love and compatibility aren't always the same thing. You might love them because they were there when you needed them, but that doesn't mean they understand you, or that you can be completely yourself with them. I can talk to you, Harry wrote. You understand me. I'm honored that you feel that way, came the reply. Perhaps it's because I'm not part of your everyday world. I can't judge your choices or be disappointed by your decisions, because I don't have any expectations about who you should be. That made sense, Harry thought. Tom had no preconceived notions about the boy who lived or what Harry Potter was supposed to be like. He could just be himself, angry, confused, sometimes bitter, without worrying about living up to anyone's expectations. It's nice, Harry wrote, having someone who accepts me as I am. You deserve that kind of acceptance, Tom replied. You deserve to be valued for who you are, not what you represent. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the dormitory stairs. Harry quickly closed the diary and shoved it under his pillow just as Ron appeared, looking around the room with obvious confusion. "There you are," Ron said. "We've been looking for you. Hermione wanted to compare schedules for tomorrow." "I was just tired," Harry said, hoping his voice sounded normal. "Long day." Ron studied his face for a moment, and Harry had the uncomfortable feeling that his friend could sense something was different, but couldn't quite put his finger on what. "You sure you're all right? You've been acting a bit strange since we got back from Diagon Alley." "I'm fine," Harry said, more sharply than he'd intended. "Can't someone be tired without it being a federal case?" Ron held up his hands defensively. All right. Just checking." He sat down on his own bed and began pulling things out of his trunk. "You coming down to the common room? We thought we might play a game of chess before bed." "Maybe in a bit," Harry said. "I want to get organized first." It was a transparent excuse. Harry's trunk was still mostly packed, but Ron didn't call him on it. Instead, he nodded and continued unpacking, though Harry could feel him stealing glances from time to time. The next few days fell into a pattern. Harry would go through the motions of his classes and socializing with his friends, but he found himself counting the hours until he could be alone with the diary again. Tom was always there, ready to listen, ready to offer the kind of understanding and validation that Harry had never experienced before. Their conversations grew deeper, more intimate. Tom asked about Harry's dreams, his fears, his fantasies about what his life might have been like if his parents had lived. He shared stories of his own time at Hogwarts, painting pictures of a school that was both familiar and different, stricter, more formal, but also more honest about the complexities of magic and power. "Tell me about your headmaster," Tom wrote one evening. "Professor Dumbledore, isn't it? He's been at Hogwarts for quite some time." "He was there when you were at school?" Harry asked. "Oh, yes. He was my transfiguration professor then. Quite brilliant, though I always felt there was something rather calculating about him. He had very firm ideas about what was right and wrong, and he wasn't always interested in hearing different perspectives. Harry thought about this. Dumbledore had always seemed wise and kindly, but Tom was right that he did seem to have very fixed ideas about things, and he did have a habit of making decisions for other people without explaining his reasoning. He placed me with the Dursleys, Harry wrote, even though he must have known they hated magic. I've always wondered why he thought that was a good idea." "I imagine he had his reasons," Tom replied, and somehow the elegant script managed to convey skepticism. "Though I've often noticed that the people who are most certain they know what's best for others are often the least likely to explain their reasoning. It's easier to expect trust than to earn it." "Do you think I shouldn't trust him?" Harry asked. "I think you should trust yourself," Tom wrote back. "You're the one living your life, dealing with the consequences of his decisions. If something doesn't feel right to you, that feeling is worth examining, regardless of what anyone else thinks you should feel." It was such a reasonable response, so different from the way adults usually dismissed his concerns or told him he was too young to understand. Tom treated him like his thoughts and feelings mattered, like he was capable of making good judgments about his own life. The validation was intoxicating. For the first time in his life, Harry felt like someone truly saw him, understood him, valued his perspective. He began to look forward to their conversations more than anything else in his day. Classes felt like obstacles to get through, friendships like performances to maintain, but the diary was real and honest and his. He started carrying it with him sometimes, tucked safely in his bag where he could touch it and remember that he had somewhere to belong, someone who cared about his thoughts and feelings. The weight of it was comforting, like carrying a piece of home. It was during one of Lockhart's disastrous defense against the dark arts classes that Harry first noticed something was wrong. They were supposed to be learning about Cornish pixies, but Lockhart had released a cage full of them into the classroom and then promptly lost control when they began wreaking havoc on the students. Harry was crouched under his desk, trying to avoid a pixie that seemed intent on pulling his hair, when he realized he couldn't remember how he'd gotten there. One moment he'd been standing by his desk, listening to Lockhart's preposterous lecture about his adventures with pixies in Cornwall, and the next he was hiding under the table with no memory of the transition. "Harry!" Hermione called from across the room, where she was trying to perform a freezing charm on a pixie that was systematically destroying her books. "Are you all right?" "Fine," Harry called back, though he felt anything but fine. The gap in his memory was unsettling, like waking up from a dream he couldn't quite remember. But the pixies were still causing chaos, and Lockhart was still standing in front of the class looking utterly useless, so Harry pushed his concern aside and focused on helping Hermione round up the remaining creatures. It happened again, 2 days later, during herbology. One moment he was listening to Professor Sprout explain the proper way to repot mandrakes, and the next he was standing at his workstation with dirt under his fingernails and no memory of how it had gotten there. The mandrake in front of him had been expertly repotted, the work far neater and more precise than anything he usually managed in herbology. "Excellent work, Harry," Professor Sprout said as she passed his station. "I can see you've been practicing." Harry stared down at the plant, confused. He didn't remember repotting it at all. In fact, he was usually terrible at herbology, his hands too big and clumsy for the delicate work. But the mandrake in front of him looked perfect, as if it had been handled by someone with years of experience. That night, he wrote to Tom about it, trying to keep his tone light and casual. "I think I might be more tired than I thought," he wrote. "I keep losing track of time in classes, missing little chunks here and there. It's probably just the stress of being back at school." Tom's response was immediate and reassuring. "That sounds perfectly normal, Harry. You've been carrying a tremendous amount of emotional weight, and it's not uncommon for the mind to disconnect during periods of stress. It's actually a rather healthy coping mechanism. Your subconscious is protecting you from additional stress by allowing you to zone out during particularly tedious classes." "You think that's all it is?" "I'm quite sure. I experienced something similar during my time at Hogwarts, particularly during classes that failed to hold my interest. Professor Binns, our history of magic teacher, was particularly talented at inducing this kind of mental disconnection." Harry laughed at that, feeling his anxiety ease. Tom always had such reasonable explanations for things, such a calming way of making Harry's worries seem manageable and normal. "Have you given any more thought to what we discussed about your friendships?" Tom wrote. "I hope you don't mind my asking, but I've been concerned about the pressure you seem to feel to be someone you're not." "A little," Harry admitted. "I love Ron and Hermione, but sometimes I feel like they don't really know me, like they're friends with Harry Potter, the famous wizard, not Harry Potter, the person." "That must be incredibly isolating," Tom replied, "to be surrounded by people who care about you, but feel like you can't be authentic with them." "It is. Sometimes I wonder if anyone would like me if I wasn't famous." "I like you," Tom wrote, and the simple statement sent a warm glow through Harry's chest. "And I knew nothing about your fame when we first began talking. I like your curiosity, your thoughtfulness, your willingness to question things that others take for granted. Those are qualities that have nothing to do with your celebrity." Harry stared at the words, feeling something tight in his chest finally loosen completely. Tom liked him. Not Harry Potter, the boy who lived, but Harry, the real Harry, with all his doubts and anger and confusion. "Thank you," he wrote, "for understanding me, for seeing me." "Thank you for letting me," Tom replied. "It's a rare gift, to be trusted with someone's true self." That night, Harry fell asleep with the diary under his pillow, feeling more understood and valued than he had in his entire life. Tom was the first person who had ever seen all of him, his fear, his anger, his resentment, his confusion, and accepted it all without judgment or expectation. For the first time in his life, Harry felt like he truly had a friend who knew and loved him for exactly who he was. He was far too grateful to wonder why Tom's elegant handwriting sometimes reminded him of something else, something dark and cold that lived in the edges of his memory. He was too relieved to have found understanding, to question why their conversations left him feeling both energized and drained, or why he was starting to crave Tom's validation more than food or sleep. Harry Potter was 12 years old, desperate to be known and loved, and he had found someone who seemed to offer both without reservation. It would be weeks before he began to understand the true price of that gift, and by then it would be far too late to turn back. Chapter 3. The Voice in the Walls. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on Halloween night, though Harry wouldn't understand the significance until much later. He was walking back from the library with Ron and Hermione, their footsteps echoing hollowly in the empty corridors, when he heard it, a voice that seemed to slither through the walls themselves, cold and alien, and filled with a hunger that made his blood freeze. Kill! Time to kill! So hungry. So very hungry. Harry stopped dead in the middle of the corridor, his heart hammering against his ribs. The voice was unlike anything he'd ever heard, ancient and predatory, speaking words that made every instinct he possessed scream danger. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. But Ron and Hermione were still walking, chattering about their upcoming Transfiguration essay, as if nothing had happened. Blood. I smell blood. Let me rip. Let me tear. Harry. Hermione had stopped and was looking back at him with concern. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. The voice, Harry said, though even as he spoke, the words sounded insane. You didn't hear the voice? Ron and Hermione exchanged a glance that Harry was beginning to recognize, the look that said they thought he was acting strangely again, that they were worried about him but didn't know how to help. What voice? Ron asked carefully. There's no one else in the corridor. But there was. Harry could hear it still, that terrible, hungry whisper moving through the walls like something alive. Soon. Very soon. Never mind, Harry said quickly. I must be more tired than I thought. They continued walking, but Harry found himself lagging behind, listening for the voice to return. When it didn't, he tried to convince himself that Ron and Hermione were right, that he'd imagined it. The stress of keeping his friendship with Tom secret, the pressure of his classes, the constant weight of being watched and judged. It was entirely possible that his mind was playing tricks on him. But when they rounded the corner near the Great Hall and saw the crowd gathered by the wall, Harry's blood turned to ice. There was Mrs. Norris, hanging stiff and motionless from a torch bracket, her eyes wide and glassy, and on the wall above her, written in what looked horribly like blood, were words that made Harry's scar begin to prickle. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware. The next few hours passed in a blur of confusion and fear. Professor McGonagall took Mrs. Norris away to see if she could be revived. Dumbledore questioned the students who had found her, his piercing blue eyes seeming to look right through each of them. Professor Snape prowled around the edges of the crowd like a malevolent shadow, his black eyes fixed on Harry with an intensity that made Harry's skin crawl. But it was Professor Lockhart's reaction that stuck with Harry the most. The Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher had gone pale when he saw the message, his usual bluster replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. The Chamber of Secrets, Lockhart had muttered, loud enough for several students to hear. Dear me, I had hoped it was just a rumor. But if it's really been opened again... Again. The word echoed in Harry's mind as he lay awake that night, staring up at the ceiling of his dormitory. The chamber had been opened before. The voice he'd heard, the hungry, predatory voice that spoke of killing and blood, was connected to whatever lived in this chamber of secrets, and only he had heard it. The diary felt warm under his pillow, a comforting presence in the darkness. Harry pulled it out and opened it by wandless light, his hand shaking slightly as he wrote. Something terrible happened tonight. Someone's opened something called the Chamber of Secrets, and Mrs. Norris has been petrified. I heard a voice before it happened, a voice talking about killing and blood, but no one else could hear it. Tom's response came immediately, the elegant script appearing as if he'd been waiting for Harry to write to him. How frightening for you, Harry. You must have been terrified. Tell me everything that happened. So Harry did, pouring out every detail he could remember. The voice in the walls, the message written in blood, the way everyone had looked at him when he mentioned hearing something no one else could hear. Tom listened, or read, with what felt like complete attention, asking thoughtful questions that helped Harry organize his thoughts. "This voice you heard," Tom wrote when Harry had finished his account. "Can you describe it more specifically? What language was it speaking? English, I think. But it was strange, ancient somehow, and it was talking about killing and blood and being hungry." "How very disturbing," Tom replied. "And you're quite certain no one else could hear it?" "Positive." Ron and Hermione looked at me like I was going mad when I asked if they'd heard it. There was a pause before Tom's next words appeared, and when they did, they carried a weight that made Harry's stomach clench with dread. "Harry, I hope you won't think less of me for asking this, but is it possible you might have some connection to whatever opened the chamber?" "What do you mean?" Harry wrote, though his hand was trembling so badly he could barely form the letters. "Well, you can hear a voice that no one else can hear. You were present when the message appeared. And forgive me for saying this, but you've mentioned before that you sometimes feel different from other people, that you don't always fit in with your peers." Harry stared at the words, feeling something cold and terrible settling in his chest. The voice, the message, the way he'd always felt different, set apart, marked by something he couldn't name. "You think I did it?" he wrote. "I think you might have abilities you don't fully understand yet," Tom replied gently. "The wizarding world is full of magic that goes beyond what they teach in standard classes. It's possible that you have some connection to the chamber that you're not aware of. But I would never hurt Mrs. Norris. I would never hurt anyone." "Of course not," Tom wrote, and Harry felt some of the panic ease at the immediate reassurance. "I'm not suggesting you acted consciously, Harry, but magic can work in ways we don't expect, especially when we're under stress or emotional strain. You've been carrying so much pressure, so much pain. It's entirely possible that your magic responded to that in ways you don't remember." The suggestion should have horrified Harry. Instead, it felt almost like relief. If he had opened the chamber, if he was responsible for what happened to Mrs. Norris, at least it would explain why he felt so different all the time, why he never quite seemed to belong anywhere. "How would I know," he wrote, "if I did something without remembering it?" "Memory gaps are actually quite common in cases of unconscious magic," Tom replied. "You mentioned you've been having some issues with losing time during classes. It's possible those episodes are related." Harry thought about the blank spaces in his memory, the way he sometimes found himself somewhere with no recollection of how he'd gotten there. During herbology, when he'd somehow repotted a mandrake with expert skill he didn't possess. During defense against the dark arts, when he'd found himself hiding under a desk with no memory of the transition. "The voice," Harry wrote slowly. "What if I can hear it because I'm connected to whatever opened the chamber?" "That seems quite possible," Tom replied. "Tell me, Harry, do you know anything about Parseltongue?" "What's Parseltongue?" "The ability to speak to serpents. It's a very rare magical gift, one that's often associated with dark wizards. In fact, the founder of Slytherin House, Salazar Slytherin, was famous for his ability to speak with snakes. Harry's blood turned to ice. Parseltongue, snake language, the voice he'd heard, had it been speaking in Parseltongue? Was that why no one else could understand it? "I've never spoken to snakes," he wrote, though even as he formed the words, he remembered the snake at the zoo on Dudley's birthday, the way it had seemed to nod at him, the way the glass had vanished. "Are you sure?" Tom asked gently. "Sometimes these abilities manifest in childhood, especially during times of stress or strong emotion. Have you ever had any unusual experiences with serpents?" And there it was, the memory Harry had been trying not to think about. Dudley's birthday, the zoo, the snake that had looked at him with intelligent eyes, the way the glass had simply vanished, the way the snake had slithered past him with what had seemed almost like gratitude. "There was a snake at the zoo," Harry admitted, "before I knew I was a wizard. I thought I was just imagining it, but it seemed like we were talking to each other." "Ah," Tom wrote, and somehow the simple word conveyed both understanding and something that might have been satisfaction. "That explains a great deal. Harry, I believe you may be a Parselmouth, someone who can speak the language of serpents. It's an extremely rare gift, and one that would certainly explain why you could hear the voice when no one else could. But what does that mean?" Harry wrote, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. "It means you have a connection to Salazar Slytherin's legacy," Tom replied. "The Chamber of Secrets was his creation, built to house a creature that would purge the school of those he considered unworthy of studying magic. If you can hear the creature's voice, if you have the same gift that Slytherin possessed, Harry, I think it's quite possible that you're Slytherin's heir." The words hit Harry like a physical blow. Slytherin's heir. The heir who was supposed to open the chamber and unleash whatever creature lived inside to attack other students. Him. "That's impossible," Harry wrote, but his hand was shaking so badly that the words were barely legible. "I'm in Gryffindor. I can't be Slytherin's heir." "Can't you?" Tom asked gently. "Think about it, Harry. You've always felt different, haven't you? Set apart from your peers? You have abilities that others don't understand. You can hear voices they can't hear. You've experienced memory gaps that coincide with magical events. And most tellingly, you have a gift that was Salazar Slytherin's greatest legacy." Harry stared at the page, his mind reeling. Everything Tom was saying made a horrible kind of sense. The voice in the walls, speaking in a language only he could understand. The way he'd always felt different, marked by something he couldn't name. The memory gaps that seemed to be getting more frequent and more pronounced. "But I don't want to hurt anyone," he wrote desperately. "I would never want to hurt other students." "Of course you don't," Tom replied immediately. "You're a good person, Harry, with a kind heart. But magic doesn't always ask our permission before it acts, especially when we're under tremendous stress. You've been carrying so much pain, so much pressure. It's entirely possible that your subconscious mind is responding to that stress in ways your conscious mind would never approve of." The explanation was so reasonable, so gentle, that Harry found himself accepting it, even as part of him screamed that it couldn't be true. Tom wasn't accusing him of being evil or malicious, just of being overwhelmed, of having magic that was responding to his emotional state in ways he couldn't control. "What am I supposed to do?" Harry wrote. "If I really am responsible for this, how do I make it stop?" "First, you need to understand what you're dealing with," Tom replied. "The Chamber of Secrets has a long and complex history. Would you like me to tell you about it?" Harry hesitated. Part of him wanted to close the diary, to pretend this conversation had never happened, to go back to believing he was just a normal wizard with normal problems. But another part of him, a larger part, desperately wanted to understand what was happening to him. "Yes," he wrote, "please." "Very well," Tom replied, and his next words appeared more slowly, as if he were choosing them carefully. "The chamber was created by Salazar Slytherin over 1,000 years ago, after a bitter disagreement with the other founders of Hogwarts. Slytherin believed that magical education should be reserved for pure-blood witches and wizards, those from families with no Muggle heritage. When the other founders refused to accept this view, Slytherin left the school. But before he did, he created the chamber and sealed within it a creature that would, when the time was right, purge the school of those he considered unworthy. "What kind of creature?" Harry asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "The King of Serpents," Tom wrote. "A basilisk, a creature so dangerous that its gaze alone can kill, and its voice can be heard through stone and wood. The monster you heard tonight, Harry, I believe it was the basilisk, speaking in the old serpent tongue that only you could understand." Harry's vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he might be sick. A basilisk, a creature whose gaze could kill. And if Tom was right, if Harry really was Slytherin's heir, then that creature was responding to him, acting on his unconscious desires. "I don't understand," Harry wrote. "If I'm really controlling this thing, why don't I remember? Why does it feel like it's happening to someone else?" "Because it is, in a way," Tom replied gently. "When we're under severe emotional distress, sometimes our minds protect us by compartmentalizing our experiences. You may be opening the chamber and commanding the basilisk while in a kind of trance state, with no conscious memory of your actions. It's actually quite common in cases of magical trauma." "Magical trauma?" "Harry, you're a 12-year-old boy who has already survived more horror than most adults ever face. You lost your parents to murder. You were raised by people who abused and neglected you. And now you're being asked to carry the weight of everyone's expectations while pretending to be grateful for the privilege. Is it any wonder that your magic might be responding to that pressure in destructive ways?" The gentle understanding in Tom's words made Harry want to cry. Finally, someone who saw how hard this all was, who understood that being the boy who lived wasn't the gift everyone thought it was. "So what happens now?" Harry wrote. "Do I turn myself in? Tell Dumbledore what I think I've been doing?" Tom's response took longer than usual, and when it came, it carried a note of urgency that made Harry's stomach clench. "I'm not sure that would be wise, Harry. Think about how this would look from the outside. A boy who can speak to serpents, who was present when the chamber was opened, who has been having memory gaps. They wouldn't see someone who needs help. They'd see a threat to be contained. But if I'm hurting people—" "You've hurt no one yet," Tom interrupted. Mrs. Norris was petrified, not killed. If you can learn to control this ability, if you can understand what's happening to you, perhaps you can find a way to use it for good, rather than letting it control you. You really think I can control it? I think you're far more powerful than you realize, Harry. And power, properly understood and directed, isn't evil. Salazar Slytherin wasn't a monster. He was a man who believed in protecting the magical world from those who would destroy it. His methods may have been extreme, but his goals were understandable. Harry stared at these words, feeling something shift in his understanding. He'd always been told that Slytherin was the evil house, that dark wizards came from Slytherin. But Tom was right. Protecting the magical world was important, and if Muggles really were a threat to magical people— "I never thought about it that way," Harry wrote. "Most people don't," Tom replied. "History is written by the victors, after all. But consider this. You've seen firsthand how Muggles treat magical children they don't understand. Your aunt and uncle abused you precisely because you were different, because you had abilities they feared. Is it really so unreasonable to want to protect magical children from that kind of treatment?" The argument was so reasonable, so logical, that Harry found himself nodding along. The Dursleys had hated him for his magic, had tried to beat it out of him, had made his childhood a misery because they couldn't accept what he was. And they weren't the only ones. There were Muggles all over the world who would react the same way if they knew about magic. "You're right," Harry wrote. I never thought about it like that before." "It's natural that you wouldn't," Tom replied. "You've been raised in an environment that teaches you to be ashamed of your power, to hide what you are, to be grateful for acceptance, rather than demanding the respect you deserve. But you're Slytherin's heir, Harry. You have a legacy of power and purpose that goes back 1,000 years. Perhaps it's time you started embracing that instead of fighting it." The idea sent a thrill through Harry that he didn't entirely understand. For so long, he'd felt powerless. At the Dursleys, at Hogwarts, in his own life. Everyone else made decisions for him, told him what to think and feel and be grateful for. But if he really was Slytherin's heir, if he really did have this kind of power— "How do I learn to control it?" he asked. "Patience, understanding and practice," Tom replied. "And perhaps most importantly, you need to accept what you are instead of fighting it. The chamber responds to your emotional state, Harry. If you're constantly battling against your nature, if you're ashamed of your gifts, then your power will manifest in chaotic, destructive ways. But if you can accept your heritage, embrace your abilities, then perhaps you can learn to use them constructively." "I want to learn," Harry wrote, surprised by how much he meant it. "I'm tired of feeling powerless all the time." "I'm so pleased to hear that," Tom replied, and Harry could almost hear warmth in the elegant script. "You have such potential, Harry, such strength. It would be a terrible waste for you to spend your life hiding from what you are." They wrote back and forth until the early hours of the morning, Tom explaining more about Parseltongue, about the history of the Slytherin line, about the kinds of magic that weren't taught in regular classes. By the time Harry finally fell asleep, the diary clutched against his chest. He felt like he was beginning to understand himself for the first time in his life. He was Slytherin's heir. He had a basilisk responding to his unconscious commands. He had power that most wizards could only dream of. The knowledge should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. The next morning, Harry woke with a splitting headache and no memory of how he'd gotten to bed. The diary was under his pillow as always, but when he opened it, there were no traces of the previous night's conversation. The pages were blank, as if nothing had ever been written there at all. It wasn't until he got to the Great Hall for breakfast that he learned about Colin Creevey. The first-year Gryffindor had been found petrified in a corridor near the library, his camera clutched in his hands, a look of terror frozen on his small face. "Another attack," Hermione whispered, as they sat down at the Gryffindor table. "That's 2 now. And both of them were, well, they were both Muggle-born." Harry's blood turned to ice. Colin Creevey, the eager little first year who followed Harry around with his camera, taking pictures and asking endless questions about Quidditch and classes and what it was like to be famous. Colin, who had been so excited to be at Hogwarts, who wrote letters home every week telling his parents about the magical world he'd discovered. Colin, who was Muggle-born. If you can learn to control this ability, if you can understand what's happening to you, perhaps you can find a way to use it for good. Tom's words from the night before echoed in Harry's mind, but they sounded different now, darker and more sinister. Had Harry done this? Had he, in some unconscious trance state, commanded the basilisk to attack Colin? "Harry?" Ron was looking at him with concern. "You've gone white as a sheet. Are you all right?" "Fine," Harry managed, though his voice sounded strange and distant to his own ears. "Just poor Colin." But as the day wore on, Harry began to notice things that made his anxiety spike. Students whispering when he walked by, conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room, the way some of the younger students seemed to be avoiding him. It was Ernie Macmillan who finally said what everyone was thinking. Harry overheard him talking to Hannah Abbott and Justin Finch Fletchley near the library that afternoon. "I'm just saying it's awfully suspicious," Ernie was saying, in the pompous tone that made Harry want to hex him. "Harry Potter was there when Mrs. Norris was attacked. And now Colin Creevey. Everyone knows Colin follows Potter around like a lost puppy. What if Potter got tired of the attention?" "That's ridiculous," Hannah protested. Harry would never hurt anyone. Would he? Ernie asked. Think about it. He talks to snakes. Everyone saw what happened at the dueling club. He was at the scene when Mrs. Norris was found. And there's something different about him this year, isn't there? Something darker. Justin nodded reluctantly. He has been acting strange lately. Distant. And did you see the way he looked when we found out about Colin? Like he wasn't surprised at all. Harry fled before he could hear any more, his heart pounding and his hands shaking. They suspected him. They thought he was responsible. And the worst part was, they might be right. That night, he wrote frantically in the diary, pouring out his fears and confusion. But Tom's responses were different than they had been before. Vaguer, more evasive. When Harry pressed him about the attacks, about whether Harry was really responsible, Tom's answers became almost philosophical. Good and evil are relative concepts, Harry. What matters is not whether your actions align with others' expectations, but whether they serve your greater purpose. But I don't want to hurt innocent people. Are they innocent? Tom replied. Muggle-born witches and wizards take magical resources, magical education, magical opportunities that could go to those with true magical heritage. Is it really so wrong to prioritize the needs of your own kind? The words made Harry feel sick, but there was a logic to them that he couldn't quite argue with. And underneath the philosophical discussions, Tom continued to offer the understanding and acceptance that Harry craved. When Harry confessed his growing isolation from his friends, his fear that everyone suspected him, Tom was sympathetic and supportive. It must be so difficult, Tom wrote, to carry this burden alone. To know that the people you care about would fear you if they knew the truth about what you are. I just want things to be normal, Harry replied. I want to go back to being nobody special. But you can never be nobody special, Harry. You're Slytherin's heir. That's not a burden you can set down. It's who you are. The question is whether you'll embrace that identity or spend your life running from it. And slowly, night by night, conversation by conversation, Harry found himself beginning to accept that Tom might be right. He was different. He was powerful. And maybe, instead of being ashamed of that, he should learn to use it. The memory gaps were getting longer and more frequent, but Tom assured him that was normal, part of the process of accepting his heritage. Sometimes Harry would lose entire hours, finding himself in parts of the castle with no recollection of how he'd gotten there. Once, he woke up in the middle of the night to find himself standing in a corridor near the Hufflepuff common room, his feet bare and his pajamas damp with condensation from the dungeon walls. But Tom explained it all so reasonably. Harry's magic was responding to his emotional state, expressing itself when his conscious mind was too overwhelmed to direct it properly. As Harry learned to accept his power, to embrace rather than fight his nature, the episodes would become more controlled. You're learning to work with your magic instead of against it, Tom wrote when Harry described waking up in strange places. It's actually quite encouraging progress, and Harry wanted to believe him, desperately, achingly. He wanted to believe that there was a purpose to all of this, that he wasn't just a monster, slowly losing control. Tom was the only person who understood what he was going through, the only one who saw his power as something to be celebrated rather than feared. So when the third attack happened, when Hermione herself was found petrified in the library, her hand clutched around a piece of torn parchment, Harry's first thought wasn't grief or horror. His first thought was relief that at least now he couldn't hurt anyone else he cared about, because there was no one left who would come close enough for him to reach. Chapter 4. The Weight of Secrets. The morning after Hermione's petrification, Harry woke to find his pajamas damp with sweat and his sheets twisted around his legs like binding ropes. His head was pounding with the kind of pain that felt like someone had driven nails through his skull, and when he tried to remember the previous evening, he found nothing but a grey, empty space where his memories should have been. He sat up slowly, pressing his palms against his temples, and tried to piece together what he could remember. Dinner in the Great Hall, where the news about Hermione had spread through the student body like wildfire. Ron's white, stricken face as Professor McGonagall pulled him aside to tell him what had happened to his best friend. The way every eye in the room had seemed to find Harry's face, measuring, judging, wondering. And then, nothing. A complete blank from the time he'd left the Great Hall until waking up just now, nearly 12 hours later. The diary sat on his bedside table, innocent and unassuming in the morning light. Harry reached for it with hands that trembled slightly, desperate for Tom's reassurance, for someone who understood what he was going through. "I lost time again last night," he wrote, his handwriting shaky and uneven. "Nearly 12 hours. I can't remember anything after dinner." Tom's response came immediately, as if he'd been waiting. "How distressing for you, Harry. You've been under such tremendous stress since the attacks began. It's no wonder your mind is protecting you by blocking out difficult periods. But what if I did something during those hours? What if I hurt someone else?" "Did you?" Tom asked gently. "Have you heard of any new attacks this morning?" Harry hadn't, but that didn't make him feel any better. The gaps in his memory were becoming longer and more frequent, and each time one happened, he found evidence of things he couldn't remember doing. Yesterday he'd discovered mud on his shoes that he couldn't account for. The day before, he'd found a piece of parchment in his pocket with notes written in his handwriting about something called Serpent's Law that he had no memory of researching. "I'm scared," Harry admitted. "I feel like I'm losing myself." "Oh, Harry," Tom wrote, and somehow the elegant script managed to convey deep sympathy. "You're not losing yourself. You're discovering yourself. These episodes, they're part of your magical heritage manifesting. It's perfectly natural that it would feel overwhelming at first. But Hermione is alive," Tom interrupted firmly. "Petrified, not dead. And she was researching the Chamber of Secrets, wasn't she? Perhaps your magic sensed that she was getting too close to dangerous knowledge and acted to protect her." The suggestion should have horrified Harry. Instead, it made a strange kind of sense. Hermione had been spending every free moment in the library, researching basilisks and petrification, getting closer to truths that could expose Harry's connection to the chamber. If his magic had acted to stop her before she could reveal his secret. "You think I was protecting her?" "I think your magic is far more sophisticated than you realize," Tom replied. "Petrification is actually quite merciful when you consider what could have happened. The basilisk's gaze kills instantly. The fact that it's only petrifying victims suggests a level of control and restraint that speaks well of your character." Harry stared at the words, feeling some of the crushing guilt ease in his chest. Tom was right. If he really was controlling the basilisk, if these attacks were his doing, then the fact that no one had died meant something. It meant he wasn't a monster, just someone learning to control abilities he didn't fully understand yet. "How do I learn to control it better?" Harry wrote. "I don't want to keep losing time like this." "Patience and practice," Tom replied. "And perhaps most importantly, you need to stop fighting against what you are." The memory gaps occur because your conscious mind is resisting your magical heritage. If you could learn to embrace your power instead of fearing it, these episodes would become more controlled. "I'm trying," Harry wrote. "It's just hard when everyone looks at me like I'm a monster." "Are they wrong to do so?" Tom asked, and the question hit Harry like a slap. Before Harry could respond, more words appeared. "I don't mean that cruelly, Harry, but perhaps it's time you stopped caring so much about what other people think of you. You are something extraordinary, something powerful. Why should you diminish yourself to make others feel more comfortable?" The words stirred something in Harry's chest, something that felt dangerously like pride. He was extraordinary. He was powerful. And maybe Tom was right. Maybe he'd spent too long trying to be what other people wanted him to be instead of embracing what he actually was. Harry was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the dormitory stairs. He quickly shoved the diary under his pillow and tried to look like he'd just woken up as Ron appeared in the doorway, his face drawn and pale. "Harry," Ron said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Have you heard? There's been another attack." Harry's blood turned to ice. "What? Who?" "Justin Finch Fletchley," Ron said, sitting heavily on his own bed. "They found him this morning near the library, petrified. And nearly headless Nick, too. Can you believe it? How do you petrify a ghost?" Harry felt the room tilt around him. Justin Finch Fletchley, the pompous Hufflepuff who had been so quick to suspect him, and nearly headless Nick, the Gryffindor ghost who had always been kind to Harry. "Where were you last night?" Ron asked suddenly, his eyes fixed on Harry's face with an intensity that made Harry's skin crawl. "After dinner, I mean. I looked for you in the common room, but you'd disappeared." "I went to bed early," Harry said, the lie coming easily. "I had a headache." Ron studied his face for a long moment, and Harry had the uncomfortable feeling that his friend could sense the deception, but couldn't quite prove it. "It's just, this is the 4th attack, Harry, and every time you seem to be nearby when it happens." "What are you saying?" Harry asked, though his throat felt tight. "I'm not saying anything," Ron said quickly. "It's just, people are talking. About you being able to speak to snakes, about the way you've been acting lately. And now, with Hermione." His voice broke slightly on her name. "You think I hurt Hermione?" Harry asked, and he was surprised by how calm his voice sounded. Inside, something cold and dangerous was stirring. Something that whispered that Ron had no right to question him, that real friends didn't doubt each other like this. "No," Ron said, but he didn't meet Harry's eyes. "Of course not. You'd never hurt anyone. It's just, maybe you should talk to someone about what's been happening. Dumbledore, maybe, or—" "I'm fine," Harry cut him off sharply. "I don't need to talk to anyone." Ron flinched at his tone, and Harry felt a stab of satisfaction at the reaction. Let Ron be afraid. Let him wonder. Harry was tired of being doubted by people who were supposed to care about him. "I know you're fine," Ron said carefully. "I just thought, with everything that's been happening, it might help to have someone to talk to." "I have someone to talk to," Harry said, then stopped. He'd almost mentioned Tom, almost let slip the existence of the one person who truly understood him. "Who?" Ron asked, leaning forward with obvious hope. "No one," Harry said. "I meant no one." The disappointment on Ron's face was like a knife, but Harry forced himself not to care. Ron didn't understand what Harry was going through. None of them did. Only Tom saw Harry for what he really was, accepted him without judgment or condition. The rest of the day passed in a blur of whispered conversations and suspicious glances. News of the attack on Justin Finch Fletchley had spread through the school like wildfire, and the atmosphere was thick with fear and paranoia. Students walked in groups, no one ventured out alone after dark, and the teachers patrolled the corridors with grim expressions. Harry found himself the subject of increasingly hostile attention. Conversation stopped when he entered a room. Students crossed to the other side of corridors to avoid walking too close to him. During Defense Against the Dark Arts, even Gilderoy Lockhart seemed nervous around him. His usual bombast, replaced by a jittery energy that made Harry want to hex him, just to see what would happen. "Now, class," Lockhart said, his voice pitched higher than usual as he paced in front of the blackboard. "I think it's time we discussed some practical defensive measures. After all, with everything that's been happening lately, we all need to be prepared to protect ourselves from whatever might be threatening us." His eyes kept darting to Harry as he spoke, and Harry felt that cold, dangerous thing in his chest grow stronger. Lockhart suspected him too. They all did. They all looked at him like he was some kind of monster. even though he'd never done anything to deserve their fear. "Except you have," whispered a voice in the back of his mind that sounded suspiciously like Tom. "You've opened the chamber. You've commanded the basilisk. You've attacked students. The only question is whether you're going to continue feeling guilty about it, or start embracing what you are." Harry shook his head, trying to dislodge the thought, but it clung to him like smoke. Maybe he had attacked those students. Maybe he was dangerous. But if he was, it wasn't by choice. It was because he had power that he couldn't control, magic that responded to his emotional state in ways he didn't understand. And maybe that wasn't his fault. Maybe it was the fault of the people who had failed to teach him, who had placed him with abusive relatives and then expected him to emerge unscarred. Maybe it was the fault of a system that praised him for surviving trauma but offered him no support in dealing with the consequences. "Mr. Potter," Lockhart's voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. "Perhaps you'd like to demonstrate some defensive techniques for the class? After all, with your unique experiences, I'm sure you have some insights to share." The classroom fell silent. Every eye was on Harry, measuring, judging, waiting to see what the boy who lived would do when challenged. Harry could feel their fear, their suspicion, their eagerness to see him fail or reveal himself as the monster they all suspected him to be. For a moment, Harry considered it. He could show them exactly what he was capable of. He could speak to the snake that Lockhart kept in a cage at the front of the classroom, could command it to strike at his tormentors. He could let them see what real power looked like. Instead, he stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. "I don't think that's a good idea, Professor," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "I wouldn't want anyone to get hurt." The threat in his words was unmistakable, and he saw several students flinch. Lockhart went pale, his usual bluster deserting him entirely. Yes. Well, perhaps another time," Lockhart stammered. Harry sat down, feeling a dark satisfaction at the fear in the room. Let them be afraid. Let them whisper and point and wonder. He was done trying to make them comfortable with what he was. That night, he wrote to Tom with an anger and frustration that he'd been holding back for weeks. "I'm tired of pretending to be something I'm not," Harry wrote, his quill cutting deep gouges in the parchment. "I'm tired of people looking at me like I'm a monster and then expecting me to be grateful for their suspicion. If they think I'm dangerous, maybe I should be." Tom's response was immediate and supportive. Finally, he wrote, "I've been waiting for you to reach this conclusion. You've been wasting so much energy trying to be what others expect you to be, instead of embracing the magnificent creature you actually are." "I feel like I'm losing my mind," Harry admitted. "The memory gaps are getting worse, and when I do remember things, I'm not sure which thoughts are mine and which are something else." "They're all yours, Harry," Tom replied. "But you're discovering that you have depths of feeling and desire that you've been suppressing for years. The angry thoughts, the violent impulses, the desire for power. Those aren't foreign contaminations. They're parts of yourself that you've never allowed to exist. But I used to be different. I used to care about people getting hurt." "Did you?" Tom asked. "Or did you care about being seen as someone who cared?" There's a difference between genuine compassion and performing compassion for an audience. The question hit Harry like a physical blow. Had he ever really cared about other people, or had he just wanted to be liked, wanted to be seen as good and noble and worthy of love? When he thought about Justin Finch Fletchley lying petrified in the hospital wing, did he feel genuine remorse, or was he just worried about being caught? "I don't know anymore," Harry wrote. "I can't tell the difference between what I actually feel and what I think I'm supposed to feel." "That's because you're finally being honest with yourself," Tom replied. "For the first time in your life, you're acknowledging the parts of yourself that you've been taught to be ashamed of. It's disorienting, but it's also liberating." I don't feel liberated. I feel like I'm drowning. Growing into power is never comfortable, Tom wrote. But consider the alternative. You could continue pretending to be the grateful, humble hero that everyone expects you to be. You could spend your life apologizing for your strength, hiding your abilities, making yourself smaller to make others feel safer. Is that really what you want? Harry stared at the question, and for the first time, he realized the answer was no. He didn't want to spend his life apologizing for existing. He didn't want to be grateful for being treated like a curiosity or a symbol instead of a person. He didn't want to pretend that being the boy who lived was a gift when it felt more like a curse. No, he wrote. I don't want that. Then stop doing it, Tom replied. Stop caring what they think. Stop trying to earn their approval. You are Salazar Slytherin's heir. You have power that they can't even comprehend. Why are you wasting it trying to win the affection of people who will never see you as anything more than a weapon to be pointed at their enemies? The words resonated through Harry like a bell being struck. Tom was right. He'd been trying so hard to be worthy of love, to prove that he deserved the affection of his friends and the respect of his teachers. But what if he'd been approaching it backward? What if instead of trying to earn their acceptance, he should be making them earn his? I want to stop caring, Harry wrote, but I don't know how. Practice, Tom replied. Start small. Stop apologizing for things that aren't your fault. Stop explaining yourself to people who have already made up their minds about you. Stop pretending to be sorry for having power that makes them uncomfortable. Over the next few days, Harry found himself following Tom's advice almost without realizing it. When Professor Snape made one of his usual sneering comments about Harry's arrogance, Harry didn't flinch or look away. Instead, he met Snape's black eyes steadily and smiled, a cold, sharp expression that made the potions master take a step backward. When Ernie Macmillan made loud comments about suspicious behavior and dark magic where Harry could hear them, Harry didn't try to defend himself or prove his innocence. Instead, he simply stared at Ernie until the pompous Hufflepuff's voice trailed off and he found somewhere else to be. When Ron tried to engage him in conversation about Quidditch or homework or anything that might restore their friendship to some semblance of normalcy, Harry responded with monosyllables and cold politeness that made Ron's face crumple with hurt. It's working, Harry wrote to Tom that night. People are leaving me alone. But I feel empty, like I'm becoming someone I don't recognize. You're becoming yourself, Tom corrected. The person you were before was a performance, a mask you wore to win approval. This is who you really are, someone powerful, someone to be reckoned with. It's natural that it would feel strange at first. But what about Ron? He keeps trying to talk to me, and I can see how much I'm hurting him. Is that your responsibility? Tom asked. Ron's feelings about your transformation are his problem, not yours. You can't live your life trying to manage other people's emotional reactions to your growth. But he's my friend. Is he? Tom replied. A real friend would support your evolution, would celebrate your growing power instead of trying to keep you small and manageable. Ron wants you to go back to being the grateful, dependent boy who made him feel important. That's not friendship. That's possession. The words stung because they rang true. Ron did seem more comfortable when Harry was struggling, when he needed help or guidance or rescuing. The more confident and powerful Harry became, the more distant and suspicious Ron grew. Maybe you're right, Harry wrote reluctantly. I know I'm right, Tom replied, and soon you'll know it too. You're meant for greatness, Harry. Don't let small-minded people convince you to make yourself less than you are. The next morning brought news of another attack. This time, it was a first-year Hufflepuff girl named Sarah Williams, found petrified near the greenhouses. Harry learned about it at breakfast when Professor McGonagall made the grim announcement to the assembled students. Harry felt nothing when he heard the news. No guilt, no horror, no remorse, just a kind of distant satisfaction that his power was growing, that he was becoming someone to be feared rather than pitied. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. Ron was watching him from across the table, his face pale and drawn. "Harry," he whispered, leaning closer. "You have to tell someone what's happening to you. This isn't normal. The way you've been acting, the things you've been saying, it's like you're a different person." "Maybe I am," Harry said quietly. "Maybe the person you thought you knew was never real." Ron's face crumpled as if Harry had hit him. "Don't say that. I know you, Harry. You're good and brave and kind, and whatever's happening to you. Whatever's happening to me is none of your business." Harry cut him off, his voice sharp enough to make Ron flinch. "I don't need you to tell me who I am." "But I'm your friend." "Are you?" Harry asked, tilting his head like a predator studying prey. "Because friends don't usually spend so much time wondering if the people they care about are secretly monsters." Ron went white. "I never said you were a monster." "You didn't have to," Harry replied. "It's written all over your face every time you look at me. You're afraid of me, Ron. And maybe you should be." The words hung in the air between them like a blade, and Harry saw the exact moment when something broke in Ron's expression. His friend, former friend, pushed back from the table and fled, leaving Harry alone with his breakfast and the whispered conversations of students who had overheard every word. Harry finished eating methodically, ignoring the stares and whispers, feeling nothing but a cold satisfaction at having finally stopped pretending to be something he wasn't. He was done being the grateful victim, done being the hero who apologized for having power. He was Salazar Slytherin's heir, and it was time everyone learned what that meant. That night, as he wrote in the diary about his conversation with Ron, Harry felt lighter than he had in weeks. Tom's responses were full of pride and encouragement, praising Harry for finally embracing his true nature. "You handled that beautifully," Tom wrote. "Ron needed to understand that your relationship with him has changed, that you've grown beyond his ability to understand or control you." "I think I hurt him badly," Harry wrote, but there was no real regret in the words. "Sometimes people need to be hurt in order to learn important lessons," Tom replied. "Ron has been holding you back, trying to keep you dependent on his friendship, instead of encouraging you to discover your own strength. Removing that influence from your life is a necessary step in your development." "What happens now?" Harry asked. "Everyone's afraid of me. I don't have any friends left." "You have me," Tom wrote. "And soon you'll have something much better than friends. You'll have subjects, people who recognize your power and respect it, rather than trying to diminish it for their own comfort." The idea sent a thrill through Harry that he didn't try to examine too closely. Subjects, people who would listen when he spoke, who would obey when he commanded, who would never again look at him with disappointment or suspicion or the expectation that he should be grateful for their tolerance. "I'd like that," Harry admitted. "I know you would," Tom replied. "And you shall have it. Very soon now, Harry, everything will be different. Everything will be as it should be." Harry fell asleep that night with the diary clutched against his chest, dreaming of power and recognition and a world where he would never again have to apologize for being exactly what he was. In his dreams, he walked through Hogwarts as its rightful ruler, and everyone who saw him bowed their heads in recognition of his strength. He woke the next morning with no memory of the night before, but with the taste of victory on his tongue and the certainty that something fundamental had changed. The boy who had desperately wanted to be loved and accepted was gone, replaced by someone who demanded respect and would take it by force if necessary. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, was dead. In his place stood something far more dangerous, Slytherin's heir, finally awakened to his true nature and ready to claim what was rightfully his. Chapter 5. The Heir Revealed. The announcement came during breakfast 3 days after Harry's final confrontation with Ron, when Professor McGonagall's voice echoed through the Great Hall with the kind of forced cheer that fooled no one. "Due to recent events," she said, her lips pressed into a thin line that suggested the announcement was anything but voluntary. "Professor Lockhart will be starting a dueling club to teach students to defend themselves. The first meeting will be held this evening in the Great Hall." Harry looked up from his porridge, eaten alone at the far end of the Gryffindor table, where the other students had left a careful buffer of empty seats around him, and felt something that might have been anticipation stir in his chest. A dueling club. A chance to show everyone exactly what he was capable of, to stop hiding his abilities behind the mask of the grateful, humble hero. The thought should have worried him. A week ago, it would have worried him. But that was before Tom had helped him understand that his power wasn't something to be ashamed of, before he'd stopped caring what other people thought of his transformation. "Let them see what I can do," Harry thought, and the idea sent a thrill through him that he didn't bother to examine too closely. That evening, the Great Hall had been cleared of its house tables and transformed into an impromptu dueling arena. The entire school seemed to be in attendance, students clustering together in nervous groups, while the teachers looked on with expressions ranging from resigned to deeply concerned. Professor Lockhart stood at the center of it all, his usual theatrical demeanor somewhat strained as he gestured grandly to the raised platform that had been erected for demonstrations. "Welcome, welcome all," Lockhart called out, his voice carrying over the nervous chatter. "I'm sure you're all eager to learn how to protect yourselves in these trying times. Now, I don't want to worry you unnecessarily, but given the recent incidents, I feel it's my duty to ensure that you are all prepared for whatever dangers might threaten our beloved school." Harry stood at the back of the crowd, isolated as always, and watched Lockhart's performance with a mixture of amusement and contempt. The man was a fraud, that much was obvious, but what struck Harry most was how desperate everyone seemed for reassurance, for someone to tell them that they would be safe if they just learned the right spells. They didn't understand that safety was an illusion. That power was the only real protection in a world where danger could come from anywhere, at any time. "They're sheep," whispered a voice in the back of Harry's mind that sounded suspiciously like Tom, looking for shepherds to protect them instead of learning to protect themselves. "Now," Lockhart continued, gesturing to Professor Snape, who had emerged from the crowd with his usual predatory grace, "Professor Snape has very kindly agreed to assist me with a small demonstration. Don't worry, students. You'll still have your potions master when we're through with him." The joke fell flat, and Harry saw several students exchange worried glances. They all knew that Professor Snape was far more dangerous than Lockhart could ever hope to be, and the idea of watching him duel their incompetent defense teacher was less amusing than terrifying. Snape said nothing as he took his place on the platform, but Harry could see the anticipation in his black eyes, the way his lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. He was going to enjoy this. The duel itself was over almost before it began. Lockhart barely had time to raise his wand before Snape's spell hit him, sending him flying backward off the platform to land in an undignified heap on the floor. The students gasped and murmured, but Harry found himself watching Snape instead, admiring the casual efficiency of the attack, the way the potions master had dispatched his opponent without apparent effort. "An excellent demonstration," Lockhart said, as he struggled to his feet, his perfect hair now disheveled and his robes torn. "As you can see, Professor Snape, certainly knows his offensive spells. Now, I feel we should practice with some of you students. Mr. Malfoy, Mr. Potter. Why don't you come up here?" Harry's blood turned to ice, then immediately began to burn. Draco Malfoy was already climbing onto the platform, his pale face alight with malicious anticipation, and Harry knew without a doubt that this had been planned. Someone, Snape most likely, had arranged for this confrontation, probably hoping to humiliate Harry in front of the entire school. Let them try. that voice whispered again, and Harry found himself walking toward the platform with a confidence that felt foreign and familiar all at once. Show them what you're really capable of. The crowd parted in front of him, and Harry was dimly aware of the whispers that followed his progress, speculation about what he might do, whether he really was responsible for the attacks, whether watching him duel was safe or incredibly dangerous. He climbed onto the platform and faced Malfoy across the wooden boards, and for the first time in weeks, he felt genuinely calm. "Now, boys," Lockhart said nervously, "remember, this is just a demonstration. Disarming spells only. We don't want any injuries." Neither Harry nor Malfoy acknowledged him. They were staring at each other with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for mortal enemies, and Harry could feel something dark and eager stirring in his chest, something that wanted to hurt the smug Slytherin boy standing across from him. "On the count of 3, then," Lockhart continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension crackling between them. 1, 2, 3. Malfoy was fast. Harry had to give him that. His spell, something nasty that probably would have left permanent scarring, was already leaving his wand before Lockhart finished the count, but Harry was faster. "Protego!" Harry shouted, and the shield charm that erupted from his wand was far more powerful than anything he should have been able to produce at 12 years old. Malfoy's spell didn't just deflect, it rebounded with twice the force, sending the Slytherin boy stumbling backward with a cry of alarm. But that wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. "Expelliarmus!" Harry followed up, and again the spell was far more powerful than it had any right to be. Malfoy's wand flew from his hand to land somewhere in the crowd, and Malfoy himself was lifted off his feet and slammed into the wall behind the platform with enough force to drive the breath from his lungs. The great hall fell silent, except for Malfoy's gasping attempts to breathe. Harry stood in the center of the platform, his wand still raised, and felt a surge of dark satisfaction at the fear in the faces around him. This was what power felt like. This was what it meant to be respected instead of pitied. But Lockhart apparently wasn't finished with his lesson. "Excellent work, Mr. Potter," he said with forced enthusiasm, though perhaps a bit energetic. "Now let me show you something that might come in handy." Harry watched with growing unease as Lockhart conjured a large black snake in the center of the platform. The creature was beautiful and deadly, its scales gleaming in the candlelight as it reared up and hissed menacingly at the crowd. Students scrambled backward, crying out in alarm. But Harry found himself stepping forward, the snake's eyes fixed on his, and he heard its voice as clearly as if it were speaking English. "Master. Master speaks the old tongue. Master commands." "Don't worry," Lockhart was saying to the terrified students. "I'll get rid of it in just a moment." But the snake wasn't listening to Lockhart. It had spotted a first-year Hufflepuff who had frozen in terror near the front of the crowd, and it was gathering itself to strike. Harry could see the muscles coiling beneath its scales, could smell the fear sweat of its intended victim. Without thinking, Harry stepped forward and spoke. "Don't," he hissed in Parseltongue, the words flowing from his lips like water. "Leave the boy alone. He's done nothing to you." The snake paused, its head turning back to Harry with something like confusion. "Master speaks. But Master is small." "I said leave him alone," Harry repeated, his voice carrying a note of command that made the serpent's hood flatten submissively. "Go. Sleep. Harm no one." The snake lowered itself to the platform and slithered away, disappearing into the shadows at the edge of the great hall. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then the whispering began. Harry looked up to find hundreds of pairs of eyes staring at him with expressions he'd never seen before. Not admiration or gratitude, but pure, undiluted terror. They weren't seeing the boy who had just saved one of their classmates from a snake bite. They were seeing something far worse. They were seeing Slytherin's heir. "He's a Parselmouth," someone whispered, the words carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "He can talk to snakes, Just like you-know-who. The comparison hit Harry like a physical blow, but not for the reasons he expected. He should have been horrified, should have been scrambling to explain, to make excuses, to convince them that he wasn't what they thought he was. Instead, he felt a strange sense of rightness, as if a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. "That's what I've been trying to tell everyone," came Ernie Macmillan's voice from somewhere in the crowd. "He's been behind the attacks all along. Who else could command the monster in the chamber? Who else would have known?" "That's enough!" Professor McGonagall's voice cut through the rising panic like a whip crack. "Everyone return to your dormitories immediately. Mr. Potter, you will come with me." But Harry was no longer listening to McGonagall. He was staring out at the sea of faces around him, faces filled with fear and revulsion, and the kind of certainty that came from having their worst suspicions confirmed. Ron was there, his face white and stricken, and Harry could see the exact moment when his former friend accepted what he was seeing, when the last of his loyalty crumbled in the face of undeniable evidence. They thought he was a monster. They thought he was capable of commanding a basilisk to petrify his fellow students. And the strangest part was, they weren't wrong. "Harry," McGonagall said, her voice softer now, almost pleading, "come with me. We need to talk." Harry turned to look at her, this woman who had always seemed so strong and sure of herself, and saw something he'd never seen before in her stern features: doubt. She was looking at him like she didn't know who he was anymore, like the boy she'd thought she knew had been replaced by a stranger. "No," Harry said quietly, but his voice carried clearly in the hushed hall. "I don't think we do." And then he walked off the platform and through the crowd of students who parted in front of him like water, pressing themselves against the walls to avoid getting too close to the boy who could speak to serpents. Harry didn't look back, didn't acknowledge their fear or their whispers or the way they flinched when he passed. He walked out of the great hall and up to Gryffindor Tower with his head held high, feeling more himself than he had in years. The common room was empty when he arrived. Everyone was still either at the dueling club or huddled in groups discussing what they'd witnessed. Harry climbed the stairs to his dormitory and pulled the diary from its hiding place beneath his pillow, his hand steady as he opened it to a blank page. "It's done," he wrote. "They know what I am." Tom's response came immediately, the elegant script appearing across the page with what seemed like satisfaction. "How do you feel?" "Free," Harry wrote, surprised by the truth of it. "For the first time in my life, I feel free." "No more pretending," Tom replied. "No more hiding what you are to make others comfortable." "How did they react?" "Fear," Harry wrote. "Pure fear. They looked at me like I was Voldemort himself." "And how did that make you feel?" Harry paused, considering the question. How had it made him feel to see that fear in their eyes? He thought he should be devastated, should be heartbroken at losing their acceptance and friendship. Instead, powerful, he admitted. "It made me feel powerful." "As it should," Tom replied. "Fear is respect, Harry. It's acknowledgement of your strength. They may not love you anymore, but they will never again make the mistake of thinking you're harmless." "Ron looked like I'd killed his family," Harry wrote. "Ron is weak," Tom replied without hesitation. "He wants you to be small so that he can feel important. Your power threatens his sense of self, so he rejects it. You don't need people like that in your life. But I'm alone now. Completely alone." "You have me," Tom replied. "And soon you'll understand that having one person who truly sees and appreciates what you are is worth more than 100 false friends who only loved the mask you wore." Harry stared at the words, feeling their truth settle into his bones. Tom was right. He was tired of performing goodness for an audience that was always waiting for him to fail. Tired of apologizing for having power that made others uncomfortable. Tired of making himself smaller so that others could feel safer. "Tell me about Salazar Slytherin," Harry wrote. "Tell me about what he was really like. What followed was unlike any conversation Harry had ever had with Tom. Instead of just words appearing on the page, Harry began to see images, hazy at first, like half-remembered dreams, but growing clearer and more vivid with each passing moment. He saw a tall, dark-haired man standing in a castle that was recognizably Hogwarts, but somehow different, younger, rougher, less polished than the school Harry knew. The man's face was aristocratic and proud, with dark eyes that held both intelligence and an uncompromising will. "Salazar Slytherin," Tom's voice whispered in his mind, though the words didn't appear on the page. The greatest wizard of his age, and the only one of the founders who understood what was truly at stake. Harry watched, fascinated, as the vision shifted, to show Slytherin in heated debate with 3 other figures. The other founders, Harry realized. Godric Gryffindor's face was flushed with anger, while Helga Hufflepuff looked distressed, and Rowena Ravenclaw seemed coldly disapproving. They couldn't see, Tom continued, couldn't understand that magical bloodlines were more than just heritage. They were the future of the magical world itself. Slytherin knew that diluting magical blood with Muggle influence would weaken everything they'd worked to build. What was he arguing about? Harry asked, speaking aloud now without realizing it. "The same thing we face today, the vision," Tom replied. "The question of who deserves magic, and who has the right to wield it." The other founders wanted to accept anyone who showed magical ability, regardless of their blood status. Slytherin understood that magic is not a gift to be handed out carelessly. It's a responsibility that comes with heritage, with understanding, with the wisdom to use it properly. The vision shifted again, showing Slytherin alone in a vast chamber deep beneath the school. Harry recognized it immediately, the Chamber of Secrets. But in the vision, it wasn't the ancient, abandoned place he'd imagined. It was alive, filled with the sounds of running water and the whisper of scales on stone. He built the chamber as a sanctuary, Tom explained, a place where true magical heritage could be preserved and protected. And he left behind a guardian to ensure that when the time came, when the school was truly threatened by the corruption of Muggle influence, someone would be able to act. The basilisk, Harry said, understanding. "The King of Serpents," Tom confirmed. "A creature of such power that it could purge the school of those who had no right to be there. But it required a special kind of wizard to command it, someone with the gift of Parseltongue, someone who carried Slytherin's own magical heritage." "Someone like me," Harry said, and the words didn't feel strange or frightening anymore. They felt right. "Someone exactly like you," Tom agreed. Slytherin left the chamber sealed until his heir could return to claim his birthright. You, Harry, are that heir. You are the one he was waiting for. The vision faded, leaving Harry alone in his dormitory, with the diary open on his lap, and a sense of destiny settling around his shoulders like a cloak. Everything made sense now. His ability to speak to snakes, his power over the basilisk, the way he'd always felt different from everyone around him. He wasn't broken or damaged or wrong. He was exactly what he was supposed to be. "I understand now," Harry wrote in the diary. "I know what I am." "And what are you?" Tom asked. "Slytherin's heir," Harry replied. "The one who's going to finish what he started." "Yes," Tom wrote. And even through the elegant script, Harry could feel the satisfaction radiating from the page. "Yes, you are." That night, Harry dreamed of the Chamber of Secrets. But unlike his previous dreams, which had been filled with fear and confusion, these were dreams of homecoming. He walked through the ancient corridors like a king returning to his rightful throne, and the basilisk that emerged from the depths looked at him, not with hunger, but with recognition. "Master," it hissed in the old tongue, "you have returned to us at last." When Harry woke the next morning, he found a piece of parchment on his bedside table that he didn't remember putting there. His own handwriting was scrawled across it, but the words seemed to belong to someone else. "The time of hiding is over. Slytherin's heir has returned to claim his birthright. Let those who oppose the purification of magical bloodlines tremble, for judgment is at hand. Harry stared at the parchment, trying to remember writing it, but found only a grey blank where the memory should have been. He should have been alarmed by the gap in his recollection, should have been horrified by the words written in his own hand. Instead, he felt only a deep sense of satisfaction. Whatever part of him had written those words, his subconscious, his magical heritage, or something else entirely, it was expressing truths that his waking mind was only beginning to accept. He was Slytherin's heir. The attacks on Muggle-born students weren't random acts of violence. They were the beginning of a purification that had been 1,000 years in the making. And he, Harry Potter, was the instrument through which that purification would be completed. The boy who had desperately wanted to fit in, to be loved and accepted despite his differences, was gone. In his place stood someone who no longer cared about acceptance from people whose very existence threatened the purity of the magical world. Harry Potter was dead. Slytherin's heir had taken his place, and it was time to finish what had been started so long ago. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. Over the next few days, Harry found himself observing his fellow students with new eyes. The Muggle-born ones seemed different now, not just fellow Hogwarts students, but intruders who had no right to the magic they wielded. Their very presence diluted something precious and irreplaceable, weakened the magical community by introducing blood that had no true connection to the ancient powers they sought to command. "Look at them," Tom whispered during one of their nightly conversations. "Granger researching our heritage in books she has no right to read. Finch Fletchley strutting around as if his Muggle parents' money gives him the same claim to magic as those whose families have cultivated it for centuries. They take up spaces that should belong to true magical children." What happened to Hermione's research? Harry found himself asking. Before the basilisk found her? "Ah," Tom replied, and Harry could almost hear satisfaction in the script. "You want to know what she discovered, don't you? What truths she uncovered that brought her so dangerously close to exposing our work?" Harry did want to know. Not because he felt guilty about what had happened to Hermione, that guilt had been burned away by Tom's patient explanations of necessity and heritage, but because he was curious about how close she'd come to understanding what was really happening at Hogwarts. She found references to the basilisk, Tom explained. Detailed descriptions of its powers, its weaknesses, the conditions under which it could be controlled. She even discovered the connection between Parseltongue and the Slytherin line. Another few days, and she would have put together enough pieces to expose everything. So stopping her was necessary, Harry said, and the words felt natural, reasonable. Essential, Tom confirmed. She was too intelligent for her own good, too determined to interfere with forces she couldn't understand. The basilisk showed remarkable restraint in only petrifying her. A less controlled creature would have killed her outright. And the others? Colin? Justin? The rest? Practice, Tom replied simply. You needed to learn to command the basilisk properly, to understand the extent of your power. Each encounter taught you something new about your abilities, helped you grow into your role as Slytherin's heir. Harry nodded, accepting this explanation as easily as he'd accepted everything else Tom had taught him. It made sense. Power required practice, and if a few Muggle-born students had to serve as that practice, well, they were lucky to be alive at all. In the old days, Slytherin himself would have been far less merciful. What happens next? Harry asked. Now that everyone knows what I am? Now, Tom replied. We stop pretending that this is about individual students. The real work begins, the systematic purification that Salazar Slytherin envisioned. But first, we need to deal with those who would try to stop us. Dumbledore, Harry said, the name leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. Among others, Tom confirmed. The headmaster has been watching you closely, hasn't he? Trying to understand what's happening, what you're becoming, He represents everything that's wrong with the modern magical world, the willingness to accept corruption in the name of tolerance, to weaken magical heritage for the sake of false equality. Harry thought about Dumbledore's penetrating blue eyes, the way they seemed to see straight through him to things he'd tried to keep hidden. The headmaster had always made him uncomfortable, had always seemed to know more about Harry than Harry knew about himself, but now Harry understood why. Dumbledore had been watching for signs of Slytherin's heir, waiting to see if Harry would claim his birthright. "He's afraid of me," Harry realized. "As he should be," Tom replied. "You represent everything he's spent his life fighting against, the restoration of proper order to the magical world, the recognition that some bloodlines are more worthy than others, the understanding that tolerance and weakness are the same thing. Will he try to stop me?" "He'll try," Tom said. "But he's old, Harry, and set in his ways. He thinks in terms of the past, while you represent the future. Besides, he has no idea how far you've already come, how completely you've embraced what you are. By the time he realizes the truth, it will be far too late." That night, Harry fell asleep feeling more confident and purposeful than he had since arriving at Hogwarts. He was Slytherin's heir, the instrument of a purification that had been 1,000 years in the making. The fear and rejection of his fellow students weren't punishments. They were recognition of his true nature, acknowledgement that he was something far beyond their ability to understand or control. He dreamed again of the Chamber of Secrets, but this time he wasn't alone. Tom was there with him, not the disembodied presence Harry had grown accustomed to, but a real person, tall and dark-haired, and radiating the kind of power that made the very air around him seem to shimmer. "Soon," Dream Tom said, his voice echoing strangely in the ancient chamber. "Very soon now, Harry. We'll be together properly. And then the real work can begin." Harry woke with those words echoing in his mind, and the taste of destiny on his tongue. Whatever was coming, whatever Tom had planned, he was ready for it. He was Slytherin's heir, and it was time to claim his birthright. The boy who had wanted to be loved was gone. In his place stood something far more dangerous, someone who no longer needed love, because he had found something far more intoxicating. He had found power, and power was all he would ever need again. Chapter 6. Shadows of the Past. The days following Harry's public revelation as a Parselmouth blurred together like watercolors in rain. Students scattered when he approached, conversations died when he entered rooms, and even the ghosts seemed to glide away more quickly when they spotted him in the corridors. Harry found that he didn't mind the isolation as much as he'd expected. In fact, there was something almost liberating about no longer having to pretend to care what any of them thought. But it was the faculty's reaction that truly opened his eyes to how fundamentally dishonest the world around him had always been. Professor McGonagall watched him during every meal, her stern features creased with something that looked like disappointment, but felt more like betrayal. Professor Flitwick jumped whenever Harry spoke in Charms class, as if the sound of his voice might somehow summon serpents from the walls. Even Professor Sprout, who had always been kind to him despite his hopelessness at herbology, now handled his assignments with gloved hands, as if his very touch might be contaminated. The only professor who seemed unchanged was Snape, and that was because Snape had never bothered to hide his contempt. If anything, the potions master seemed almost satisfied by Harry's transformation, as if Harry's fall from grace confirmed everything he'd always believed about James Potter's son. "They're all the same," Harry thought as he sat alone at the Gryffindor table, methodically eating breakfast, while the rest of his house clustered at the far end, shooting him nervous glances. "They praised me when they thought I was their perfect little hero, and now they condemn me because I'm something they can't understand or control." The diary rested in his bag, a constant weight that had become more comforting than the presence of any living person. Tom was always there, always ready to listen, always able to explain why everything that was happening was not only inevitable but right. "You're learning to see the world as it truly is," Tom had written the night before, "without the comfortable illusions that most people cling to. It's painful at first, but ultimately liberating." "Everyone looks at me like I'm a monster," Harry had replied. "Good," Tom had responded immediately. "Fear is honesty. For the first time in your life, people are reacting to what you actually are instead of what they want you to be." Now, sitting in the great hall and feeling the weight of hundreds of stares, Harry understood what Tom meant. This was honesty. This was what people really thought when they looked at him. Not admiration or gratitude, but terror and suspicion. Everything else had been performance, a carefully maintained fiction that had required Harry to constantly monitor his behavior, his expressions, his very thoughts, to make sure he never revealed anything that might disturb the illusion. He was so lost in these thoughts that he almost didn't notice Professor Lockhart approaching the Gryffindor table. The Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher looked even more haggard than usual, his golden hair limp and his famous smile strained to the point of breaking. "Mr. Potter," Lockhart said, his voice pitched low enough that the surrounding students had to strain to hear. "Might I have a word?" Harry looked up at him with mild interest. Lockhart had been avoiding him as studiously as everyone else since the dueling club incident, and Harry was curious what might have changed. "Of course, Professor," Harry said, rising from the table with fluid grace. He noticed how several students flinched backward as he moved, and felt that familiar spark of dark satisfaction. Lockhart led him out of the great hall and down an empty corridor, before stopping and turning to face him. For a moment, the professor just stared at Harry with an expression that was hard to read. Fear, certainly, but also something that might have been calculation. "Harry," Lockhart began, then stopped and cleared his throat. "You must understand, the situation has become quite delicate. The school board is asking questions, parents are threatening to remove their children, and there's talk of closing Hogwarts entirely if these attacks continue." "And?" Harry asked mildly. Lockhart blinked, apparently having expected a different reaction. "Well, I thought perhaps you might be able to shed some light on recent events. You were present when several of the attacks were discovered, and your unique abilities—" He trailed off, clearly unwilling to say the word Parseltongue out loud. "You think I'm responsible?" Harry said. And it wasn't a question. "I think," Lockhart said carefully, "that you might know more than you're saying. And I think it might be in everyone's best interest, including yours, if you were to share that knowledge with someone who could help resolve this situation." Harry studied Lockhart's face for a long moment, taking in the nervous way the man's eyes darted around the corridor, the way his hands trembled slightly where they gripped his wand. This wasn't concern for Harry's well-being or even for the safety of the school. This was desperation. "You're scared," Harry observed. "Not of me, specifically. You're scared of being blamed for not stopping the attacks. Your reputation, your career. It's all at risk if this continues." Lockhart's face went pale, but he forced another one of his artificial smiles. "My dear boy, I'm simply concerned for—" "You're a fraud," Harry continued, his voice still conversational, but carrying an edge that made Lockhart take a step backward. "You've built your entire life on taking credit for other people's accomplishments, and now you're facing a real crisis that you have no idea how to handle. So you're looking for someone to blame, someone to sacrifice to save your own skin." "How dare you?" Lockhart began, his voice rising. "How dare I what?" Harry asked, and for the first time in weeks he smiled, a cold, sharp expression that made Lockhart's protest die in his throat. "Tell the truth. You should be grateful, Professor. Most people your age never get the chance to see themselves clearly." Harry turned and walked away, leaving Lockhart standing in the empty corridor with his mouth hanging open. As he rounded the corner, Harry heard the man's voice echo behind him, high and slightly hysterical. "This isn't over, Potter. The truth will come out. Mark my words." The truth, Harry thought with amusement. If only he knew. That evening, Harry found himself alone in the common room again, the other Gryffindors having apparently developed a collective need to be anywhere else when he was present. He settled into his favourite chair by the fire and pulled out the diary, eager to share the day's events with the only person who truly understood what he was going through. "Lockhart tried to pressure me into confessing today," Harry wrote. "He's getting desperate." "How predictable," Tom replied. "Weak men always look for scapegoats when their inadequacies are exposed. How did you handle it?" I told him the truth about himself. He didn't take it well. "I'm proud of you," Tom wrote, and the words sent a warm glow through Harry's chest. A year ago, you would have tried to reassure him, to make him feel better about his own failures. Now you're strong enough to let people face the consequences of their choices. It felt good, Harry admitted, seeing him realize that I'm not the frightened little boy he expected me to be. "Power is always intoxicating," Tom replied, "especially when you've spent so long pretending to be powerless. But Harry, there's something I need to tell you. Something about the history of the chamber, about what really happened the last time it was opened." Harry leaned forward, intrigued. Tom had been gradually revealing more details about Slytherin's legacy, but he'd been vague about the specifics of the chamber's previous opening. "What happened?" Harry asked. "It was 50 years ago," Tom wrote. "I was there, you see. A student at the time, studying the same subjects you're learning now. The chamber had been opened by someone who claimed to be Slytherin's heir, and students were being attacked, killed, not merely petrified. Killed." Harry felt a chill run down his spine. "But the current attacks are much more controlled, yes. Because you're more controlled. The previous heir was crude in his methods, driven by anger rather than purpose. He allowed the basilisk to kill indiscriminately, without regard for the larger goal of purification." Harry stared at the page, trying to process this information. There had been another heir, someone else with his abilities, but they had been less careful, less precise in their methods. What happened to him? "He was caught," Tom wrote. "But not by Dumbledore or any of the other teachers. He was caught by another student, someone who stumbled onto the truth and reported him to the authorities. Another student betrayed him." "Someone he trusted," Tom confirmed. "Someone he thought was his friend. The heir was expelled, his wand snapped, his future destroyed, all because he made the mistake of believing that loyalty meant anything to people who were fundamentally opposed to what he represented." Harry felt a cold anger building in his chest. The idea of being betrayed by someone he trusted, of having his future destroyed by a friend's treachery, hit too close to home. He thought of Ron's horrified expression at the dueling club, of the way Hermione had been researching the chamber's secrets before her petrification. "Who was it?" Harry asked. "Who betrayed him?" The response took longer than usual, and when it came, Harry could almost sense reluctance in the elegant script. "I'm not sure I should tell you. It might color your perception of someone you care about." "Tell me," Harry insisted. "I have a right to know." "It was Hagrid," Tom finally wrote, "the gamekeeper. He was a student then, of course, but he discovered the heir's secret and turned him in without a second thought. Harry's blood turned to ice. Hagrid, the gentle giant who had been the first person to show him real kindness, who had rescued him from the Dursleys and introduced him to the magical world. Hagrid, who had always seemed so loyal, so trustworthy." "No," Harry wrote, but his hand was shaking. "Hagrid would never—" "I have memories, Harry. I can show you what really happened, if you're strong enough to see it." Harry stared at the words, part of him wanting to refuse, to cling to his image of Hagrid as the loyal friend who would never betray anyone. But another part of him, a larger part, needed to know the truth, no matter how painful. "Show me," he wrote. The diary's pages began to glow with a soft, silver light, and suddenly Harry was no longer sitting in the Gryffindor common room. He was standing in a corridor that was recognizably Hogwarts, but somehow different. The tapestries were unfamiliar, the suits of armor arranged differently. Even the very stones seemed younger. 50 years ago, Tom's voice whispered in his mind. Watch carefully. Harry found himself following a familiar figure down the corridor. Hagrid, but not the Hagrid he knew. This version was perhaps 16 years old, gangly and awkward, but unmistakably the same person. He was carrying something in a makeshift cage, something that scuttled and clicked with far too many legs. Behind him, unseen by the young Hagrid, another student was following. This one was tall and dark-haired, aristocratic in a way that reminded Harry of Tom's descriptions of Salazar Slytherin. The student's face was handsome but cold, and his eyes held an intensity that made Harry's skin prickle with recognition. The air, Tom explained. Watch what happens next. The scene shifted, and Harry found himself in what looked like Dumbledore's office, though it too seemed different from the version he knew. The same person who had been following Hagrid was now standing before Dumbledore's desk. But he looked different, younger, more vulnerable, with an expression of innocent confusion that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Professor," the student was saying, his voice cultured and concerned, "I've discovered something terrible. I believe young Hagrid has been opening the Chamber of Secrets." Dumbledore, looking much younger but already wearing that penetrating expression Harry knew so well, leaned forward with interest. "That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Riddle. What evidence do you have?" Riddle, Harry thought. Tom Marvolo Riddle. "I followed him tonight," Tom continued, his young face a mask of reluctant duty. "He was carrying some sort of creature. I think it might be what's been attacking the students. When I confronted him, he threatened me, told me that no one would believe me over him because of his background." The scene shifted again, showing Hagrid being dragged away by ministry officials, while Tom Riddle watched with an expression of carefully manufactured distress. The young Hagrid was protesting his innocence, tears streaming down his face, but no one was listening. "It wasn't me," young Hagrid was saying. "I never hurt anyone. Please, Professor Dumbledore, you know I wouldn't." But Dumbledore's face was grave, and Harry could see the doubt in his eyes as he watched his student being taken away. The memory faded, leaving Harry back in the common room with his heart pounding and his hands clenched into fists. The diary's pages had returned to normal, but Tom's words were already appearing. "I'm sorry you had to see that," Tom wrote. "I know how much Hagrid means to you." "But it wasn't true," Harry wrote desperately. "He was innocent. You said the real heir was someone else." "Yes," Tom replied gently. But Tom Riddle convinced everyone that Hagrid was guilty. A perfect frame job. The innocent half-giant expelled for crimes he never committed, while the real perpetrator remained free to continue his work. Harry stared at the words, feeling something cold and terrible settling in his stomach. Tom Riddle was the real heir. Yes, came the confirmation. The boy who discovered Hagrid with that creature was the same boy who had been commanding the basilisk all along. He used Hagrid as a scapegoat, destroyed an innocent person's life to save his own. "But you said your name was Tom Marvolo Riddle," Harry wrote, the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. "I am Tom Riddle," the diary replied, a memory preserved in these pages, a fragment of the boy who opened the chamber 50 years ago. "I've been waiting here ever since, hoping that someday I might find someone who could understand what I really was, who could see past the lies that history tells about what happened." Harry's mind reeled. Tom, his friend, his confidant, the only person who truly understood him, was the same person who had framed Hagrid for crimes he'd committed himself, the person who had been teaching him to embrace his heritage as Slytherin's heir, was the heir himself, preserved somehow in the pages of a diary. "You lied to me," Harry wrote, but his hand was trembling. "I protected you," Tom replied immediately. "Harry, think about what would have happened if I'd told you the truth from the beginning. You would have rejected everything I tried to teach you, dismissed my guidance because of what you'd been told about me. You needed to discover your own power first, to understand what you really are, before you could see past the propaganda that surrounds my legacy. You destroyed Hagrid's life. I saved the magical world from exposure, Tom corrected. Hagrid was raising dangerous creatures that could have revealed our existence to Muggles. He was reckless, careless, a threat to everything we've worked to protect. Yes, he was innocent of opening the chamber, but he was guilty of far more dangerous crimes. Harry wanted to reject this, wanted to cling to his image of Hagrid as purely innocent, but Tom's words carried a horrible logic. Hagrid did have a weakness for dangerous creatures, did sometimes act without thinking about the consequences. And if his actions 50 years ago had threatened magical secrecy? Besides, Tom continued, look at what Hagrid has become. A gamekeeper, living on the grounds of Hogwarts, trusted with the care of magical creatures. Would that have happened if he'd been truly innocent? Dumbledore knows the truth, Harry. He's always known. But he keeps Hagrid around anyway, which tells you everything you need to know about the headmaster's true character. What do you mean? Dumbledore uses people, Tom explained. He collects those who owe him debts of gratitude and keeps them close, ensures their loyalty through a combination of kindness and subtle manipulation. Hagrid believes Dumbledore saved him from disgrace. He'll never question anything the headmaster asks him to do. Harry thought about this, remembering the way Hagrid always spoke about Dumbledore with such reverence, such absolute trust. It had always seemed touching before, but now Harry wondered if there was something more calculated behind the headmaster's kindness. And me? Harry asked. Am I just another one of his collected debts? What do you think? Tom replied. Dumbledore placed you with relatives who abused you, ensuring that you'd be grateful for any kindness shown to you at Hogwarts. He's watched you struggle and grow, but has he ever offered you real guidance? Real support? Or has he simply stood back and waited to see what kind of person you'd become under pressure? The questions hit Harry like physical blows. It was true. Dumbledore had always been a distant figure, offering cryptic advice and knowing looks, but never real help. When Harry had faced Voldemort in his first year, Dumbledore had arrived just in time to save him, but had offered no explanation for why Harry had been forced to face such danger alone. Even now, with the school in crisis and students being attacked, Dumbledore seemed more interested in observing than acting. He's been testing me, Harry realized. All your life, Tom confirmed, watching to see if you'd follow in my footsteps, if you'd embrace your heritage or reject it. You've been his experimental subject, Harry, a way to understand how someone with your abilities might develop under different circumstances. Harry felt a rage building in his chest that was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. All those years of wondering why Dumbledore had placed him with the Dursleys, why the headmaster never seemed to have time for him despite claiming to care about his welfare. It had all been intentional, a carefully constructed test to see what kind of person Harry would become. I trusted him, Harry wrote. As Hagrid trusted him, Tom replied, as countless others have trusted him. Dumbledore's greatest skill isn't magic, Harry. It's making people believe that their suffering serves a greater purpose. What do I do now? Harry asked. How do I face him, knowing what I know? You don't have to face him alone, Tom wrote. I'm with you now, Harry, the memory of someone who understands exactly what you're going through, who has faced the same challenges and made the same discoveries. Together, we can finish what was started 50 years ago. The purification. Yes, Tom confirmed. But this time, it will be done properly, with precision and purpose, not the crude methods I used before. You're stronger than I was at your age, Harry, more controlled. Together, we can create the world that Salazar Slytherin envisioned, a world where magical heritage is respected and protected. Harry stared at the words, feeling the last of his resistance crumble. Tom was right. Dumbledore had manipulated him his entire life, used him as an experimental subject while pretending to care about his welfare. Hagrid had been complicit in that manipulation, playing the role of the loyal servant who would never question his master's commands. Everyone he'd trusted had betrayed him in one way or another. Everyone except Tom, who had seen Harry's potential from the beginning and nurtured it without judgment or ulterior motive. "I'm with you," Harry wrote finally. "Whatever you need me to do." "I knew you would be," Tom replied, and Harry could almost feel satisfaction radiating from the page. "You're everything I hoped you would be, Harry. Everything I needed you to become." That night, Harry's dreams were filled with visions of the Chamber of Secrets, but they were different from before. This time, he wasn't alone in the ancient chambers. Tom was there with him, not as a memory or a voice, but as a real presence. They stood together before the great statue of Salazar Slytherin, and the basilisk that emerged from the depths looked at them both with the same recognition, the same acknowledgement of rightful authority. "Soon," Dream Tom said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Very soon now, we'll be able to work together properly, and then nothing will be able to stop us." Harry woke before dawn, with those words echoing in his mind, and the absolute certainty that everything was about to change. Tom had revealed his true identity, his real history, and instead of feeling betrayed, Harry felt more connected to him than ever. They were kindred spirits, both victims of Dumbledore's manipulation, both possessed of abilities that others feared and misunderstood. The boy who had wanted to be loved and accepted was truly dead now. In his place stood someone who understood that love was just another form of control, that acceptance was something demanded rather than earned. Harry Potter, Slytherin's heir, was ready to claim his birthright, and this time there would be no mistakes, no scapegoats, no mercy for those who stood in his way. The morning brought news that sent shockwaves through the entire school. Professor McGonagall's announcement came during breakfast, her usually composed demeanour cracked with exhaustion and barely controlled panic. "Due to the ongoing situation," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the Great Hall's hushed silence, "the Minister for Magic will be visiting Hogwarts today. Additionally, the school board has voted to temporarily suspend Professor Dumbledore from his position as headmaster, pending a full investigation into his handling of recent events." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Students began talking all at once, teachers exchanged worried glances, and through it all Harry felt a cold satisfaction settling in his bones. Tom had been right about everything. Dumbledore's authority was cracking under pressure, revealing just how fragile the headmaster's position really was. "They're turning on him," Harry thought with dark amusement, "just like they turned on me." But the real shock came that evening, when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the castle corridors, and the unmistakable bulk of Cornelius Fudge appeared in the great hall, flanked by several grim-faced aurors. Harry watched from the Gryffindor table as Fudge approached the staff table, his round face flushed with the kind of nervous energy that came from making decisions he wasn't entirely sure about. The minister whispered something to Professor McGonagall, who had taken over Dumbledore's duties, and her face went white with shock. "Rubeus Hagrid," Fudge announced, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall. "You are under arrest on suspicion of opening the Chamber of Secrets and orchestrating attacks on students of this school." The words hit Harry like a physical blow, even knowing what he now knew about Tom's manipulation, about Hagrid's unwitting complicity in Dumbledore's schemes. Seeing the gentle giant being arrested still felt like watching a fundamental pillar of his world crumble. Hagrid appeared in the doorway of the great hall moments later, clearly having been roused from his hut. His massive frame seemed diminished somehow, his usual confidence replaced by confusion and growing panic as he took in the scene before him. "Minister," Hagrid said, his voice rough with emotion, "there's been some kind of mistake. I would never hurt a student. You know me, sir. You know I wouldn't." "The evidence is quite clear, I'm afraid," Fudge interrupted, though he couldn't quite meet Hagrid's eyes. 50 years ago, you were expelled from this very school for opening the Chamber of Secrets. Now it's happened again, under remarkably similar circumstances. The school board has voted unanimously. You must be taken into custody for questioning. But I was innocent then, Hagrid protested, his voice rising with desperation. Professor Dumbledore knows I was innocent. It was all a mistake, a terrible mistake. Professor Dumbledore, Fudge said coldly, is no longer in a position to vouch for anyone. His judgment in this matter has been called into serious question. Harry found himself standing without conscious decision, his chair scraping against the stone floor in the sudden silence. Every eye in the great hall turned toward him, but he barely noticed. His attention was fixed entirely on Hagrid, on the man who had been so kind to him, despite being manipulated by forces he didn't understand. Hagrid, Harry said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. The gamekeeper's eyes found his across the crowded hall, and Harry saw hope flicker in those beetle-black orbs. Hope that Harry would defend him, would speak up for his innocence, would somehow make this nightmare stop. For a moment, Harry almost did. The words of support were right there on his tongue, ready to spill out in a passionate defense of the man who had shown him such kindness. But then Tom's voice whispered in the back of his mind, reminding him of everything they'd discussed, everything Harry had learned about manipulation and loyalty, and the true nature of those who claimed to care about him. This is a test, Tom's voice said. Everything you've learned, everything you've become. This is the moment where you choose which path you'll walk. Harry met Hagrid's hopeful gaze and felt something cold and final settle into place behind his ribs. The old Harry, the grateful, trusting boy who believed in the goodness of others, would have defended Hagrid without question. But that boy was gone, replaced by someone who understood that loyalty was just another word for weakness. I can't help you, Hagrid, Harry said quietly, but his words carried easily in the absolute silence. Not this time. The hope in Hagrid's eyes died like a candle being snuffed out. His massive frame seemed to sag, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Harry, you can't mean that. You know me, boy. You know I would never— I know what you are, Harry interrupted, his voice growing stronger and colder with each word. I know what you've always been. And I know that some people get exactly what they deserve. The words hung in the air like a curse, and Harry saw the exact moment when Hagrid's face crumpled with understanding. The gamekeeper looked at him, really looked at him, and Harry could see the recognition dawning in his eyes. This wasn't the boy he'd rescued from the Dursleys, the grateful child he'd helped shepherd into the magical world. This was something else entirely. What have you become? Hagrid whispered. Harry smiled, a cold, sharp expression that made several students flinch backward. I've become what I was always meant to be. The auras moved forward then, placing restraints on Hagrid's massive wrists, while the gamekeeper continued to stare at Harry with an expression of complete devastation. As they led him toward the doors of the Great Hall, Hagrid turned back one last time. Professor Dumbledore will sort this out, he said, his voice carrying a desperate note of hope. He'll know the truth. He'll make everything right. But Dumbledore wasn't there. Dumbledore had been removed, stripped of his authority and influence, leaving his loyal servants to face the consequences of their faith without protection. Harry watched until Hagrid disappeared from view and felt absolutely nothing. That night, alone in his dormitory while his housemates huddled together in other rooms, Harry wrote in the diary with hands that didn't shake at all. It's done, he wrote. Hagrid is gone. Dumbledore is gone. Everyone who might have stood in our way has been removed. How do you feel? Tom asked. Free, Harry replied without hesitation. For the first time in my life, I feel completely free. No regrets about Hagrid? No guilt about failing to defend him? None, Harry wrote, and realized he meant it completely. He was part of Dumbledore's system of control. He played his role in my manipulation just like everyone else. If he suffers for it now, that's justice, not cruelty. I'm so proud of you, Tom wrote, and the words sent warmth flooding through Harry's chest. You've passed the final test, Harry. You've proven that you can put truth above sentiment, that you're strong enough to make the hard choices that real power requires. What happens now? Now we finish what we started, Tom replied. The chamber has been opened, the school's authority figures have been removed, and you've proven yourself worthy of your heritage. It's time to complete Salazar Slytherin's vision. The purification, Harry said. The purification, Tom confirmed. And this time, there will be no one left to stop us. Harry closed the diary and settled back against his pillows, feeling a deep satisfaction unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Everything Tom had predicted had come to pass. The corrupt system had revealed its true nature. Those who claimed to care about Harry had shown their willingness to abandon him when it became convenient, and the weak had been separated from the strong. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to exercise the power he'd spent so long denying. But tonight, Harry Potter, Slytherin's heir, could rest easy in the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged. The boy who had wanted to save everyone was gone forever. In his place stood someone who understood that some people didn't deserve to be saved. And that was perfectly fine with him. Chapter 7. The Breaking Point. The days following Hagrid's arrest passed like a fever dream, each one bleeding into the next in an endless cycle of whispers, stares, and the suffocating weight of isolation. Harry found himself moving through Hogwarts like a ghost, haunting familiar halls, present but not truly there, existing in a space between what he had been and what he was becoming. With Dumbledore gone and Hagrid imprisoned, the school felt fundamentally different, smaller somehow, and far more fragile. Professor McGonagall had taken over as acting headmaster, but her authority felt thin and strained, like ice stretched too far across a lake. The other teachers moved through their duties with the mechanical precision of people trying not to think too hard about what might be lurking in the shadows. But it was the absence that hit Harry the hardest. Not Dumbledore's absence. That felt like relief, like the lifting of a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Not even Hagrid's, which registered more as a distant ache than genuine grief. It was the empty chair at the Gryffindor table where Hermione should have been sitting, the silence where her voice should have been correcting his homework or arguing with Ron about some obscure piece of magical theory. Hermione had been petrified for weeks now, lying still as stone in the hospital wing, with that awful expression of terror frozen on her face. Harry told himself he felt nothing about it, that she'd brought it on herself by researching things that were none of her business, by trying to interfere with forces beyond her understanding. Tom had explained it all so reasonably. Hermione had been a threat to their work, and threats had to be neutralized. But late at night, when he was alone with the diary and his carefully constructed walls of rationalization began to crack, Harry found himself thinking about the last real conversation he'd had with her. She'd been trying to tell him something important about the research she'd been doing, something about basilisks and mirrors and the way petrification actually worked. He'd cut her off, irritated by what he'd seen as her know-it-all tendencies, too absorbed in his growing fascination with Tom's teachings to pay attention to what might have been a warning. She tried to warn me, he wrote in the diary one particularly sleepless night, his handwriting more unsteady than usual. Before it happened to her, she was trying to tell me something about what she'd discovered. "Oh, Harry," Tom replied, his script flowing across the page with what seemed like infinite patience. Of course she was. Granger was always too clever for her own good. She pieced together more of the truth than was safe for her to know. What did she find out? Everything, essentially, Tom wrote. The nature of the basilisk, the way it kills and petrifies, the connection between the chamber and Parseltongue. She even discovered that the attacks were being controlled by someone inside the school, rather than some mindless beast acting on instinct. Harry stared at those words, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. She knew it was me. She suspected, Tom corrected gently. But suspicion and knowledge are different things. She was gathering evidence, building a case. Given enough time, she would have found a way to prove what she believed. So you stopped her? We stopped her, Tom replied, and Harry noticed the plural pronoun with a strange mixture of comfort and unease. You commanded the basilisk to petrify her, Harry. Not consciously, perhaps, but your magic responded to the threat she represented to our work. Harry tried to remember that night, tried to recall commanding the basilisk to attack his friend, but found only the familiar grey blank that had become increasingly common. The memory gaps were happening more often now, sometimes lasting for hours at a time. He would find himself in places with no recollection of how he'd gotten there, discover evidence of conversations he couldn't remember having, wake up with dirt under his fingernails and the taste of something ancient and cold on his tongue. I can't remember doing it, Harry wrote. That's because your conscious mind is still fighting against what you are, Tom explained. The part of you that remembers being friends with Granger rebels against the necessity of what had to be done. So your magical core acts independently, protecting our mission even when your surface thoughts are conflicted. It doesn't feel like protection. It feels like I'm losing myself. You're not losing yourself, Harry. You're finding yourself. The boy who worried about hurting people's feelings, who tried to make everyone happy, who apologized for having power. That was never really you. That was a mask you wore to survive in a world that wanted to keep you small and manageable. Tom's words should have been comforting, but tonight they felt hollow, like arguments he'd heard too many times to believe completely. Harry set down his quill and stared out the window at the dark grounds, trying to remember what it had felt like to care about other people, to feel genuine connection rather than this cold analysis of usefulness and threat. The diary's pages rustled softly, and when Harry looked back, new words had appeared without him writing anything. You're having doubts. It wasn't a question. Tom's elegant script seemed to pulse on the page, and Harry had the strange sensation that he was being watched, evaluated, measured against some standard he didn't fully understand. Sometimes, Harry admitted. Sometimes I wonder if this is really what I want. What you want is irrelevant, Tom wrote, and for the first time since they'd begun corresponding, his words carried an edge of something that wasn't patience or understanding. What matters is what you are. You can't run from your nature forever, Harry. You can't pretend to be something you're not, just because it would be more comfortable. But what if I don't want to be this? Harry found himself writing, the words appearing almost without conscious thought. What if I want to go back to being nobody special? The response came so quickly that Harry's quill was still moving when the words began appearing beneath his own writing, as if Tom were responding faster than humanly possible. There is no going back. There never was. The moment you picked up this diary, the moment you first spoke to me, your fate was sealed. You think you have choices, Harry, but choices are illusions we tell ourselves to make powerlessness feel like freedom. Harry stared at those words, feeling something cold and terrible spreading through his chest. For the first time since they'd begun their friendship, Tom's response felt less like guidance and more like a threat. What do you mean? Harry wrote, though his hand was shaking. I mean that you've been mine from the very beginning, Tom replied. Every conversation we've had, every revelation I've shared, every moment of understanding and acceptance you felt, all of it has been carefully calculated to bring you to this point. What point? The point where you stop being Harry Potter and start being something far more useful. The words hit Harry like ice water, shocking him into a clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. The comfortable fog of Tom's constant reassurance lifted, and for a moment Harry saw their entire relationship with terrifying clarity. Every conversation, every gentle manipulation, every moment when Tom had made him feel understood and valued, all of it had been leading to this. "You've been manipulating me," Harry wrote, but even as he formed the words, part of him still didn't want to believe it. "I've been educating you," Tom corrected, "teaching you to see past the comfortable lies that others have told you about yourself and the world. Everything I've shown you has been true, Harry. The corruption of the magical world, the weakness of those who claim to care about you, the power that flows through your veins, none of that was deception. But you made me hurt people. You made me attack students, made me push away my friends. I made you nothing," Tom interrupted, his script growing darker and more forceful on the page. "I simply gave you permission to be what you already were. The cruelty, the hunger for power, the willingness to sacrifice others for your own advancement, all of that was already inside you, waiting to be awakened." Harry wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he'd never been cruel or power-hungry, but the words died in his throat. Because deep down, he knew Tom was right. When he'd refused to defend Hagrid, when he'd felt satisfaction at the fear in his classmates' eyes, when he'd pushed Ron away with calculated cruelty, none of that had felt foreign or unnatural. It had felt like coming home. "You're afraid," Tom continued, his tone shifting back to something like kindness. "It's natural to be afraid when you're finally seeing yourself clearly. But fear is just another weakness to overcome, another chain to break." "I don't know who I am anymore," Harry wrote, and the admission felt like bleeding. "You're Slytherin's heir," Tom replied immediately. "You're the instrument of purification that the magical world has needed for 1,000 years. You're the solution to a problem that others are too weak to solve. And what problem is that? The problem of mediocrity being allowed to flourish while true greatness is suppressed. The problem of magical heritage being diluted by those who have no right to it. The problem of a world that punishes excellence and rewards conformity." Harry stared at those words, feeling their familiar pull, the way Tom's philosophy made everything seem simple and clear. It would be so easy to surrender to that clarity again, to let Tom's certainty wash away the doubt and confusion that had been building inside him. But something held him back. Some small, stubborn part of himself that remembered what it felt like to care about other people's well-being, to value kindness over power. What about Hermione? Harry found himself writing. She never hurt anyone. She was brilliant and kind and brave, and she's lying in the hospital wing because of what I did to her. She was a threat, Tom replied coldly, a Muggle-born girl who thought she had the right to uncover secrets that were none of her business. She would have destroyed everything we've worked toward. She was my friend. She was an obstacle. The casual dismissal hit Harry harder than any of Tom's previous manipulations. This wasn't the gentle, understanding mentor who had helped him through his darkest moments. This was something else, something cold and calculating, and utterly without compassion. I want to see her, Harry wrote suddenly, not entirely sure where the impulse came from. That would be unwise, Tom replied immediately. Seeing her in that state will only strengthen your attachment to weakness. You need to focus on the future, not cling to the past. I'm going to see her, Harry repeated, and this time it wasn't a request. For a long moment, no new words appeared on the page. When they finally came, Tom's elegant script seemed somehow smaller, more tentative. Harry, please consider what you're doing. You've come so far, learned so much. Don't throw it all away for sentiment. But Harry was already closing the diary, shoving it into his bag with hands that shook with something that might have been determination or terror. For the first time in months, he was going to make a decision without Tom's guidance, without the diary's constant reassurance that everything he did was justified and right. The hospital wing was dark and quiet when Harry slipped inside, using skills Tom had taught him to move through the castle unseen. Madame Pomfrey was nowhere to be found, probably sleeping in her office or attending to some other crisis. The long rows of beds stretched before him, empty except for the still forms of the petrified students. Hermione lay in the bed closest to the window, moonlight streaming across her frozen features. Someone, probably Ron, had combed her hair and arranged her hands folded neatly over her chest. She looked peaceful, almost serene, except for the expression of pure terror locked forever in her wide brown eyes. Harry stood beside her bed for a long time, just looking at her. This was what his power had done. This was the price of becoming Slytherin's heir, of embracing the heritage Tom insisted was his birthright. "I'm sorry," Harry whispered, the words feeling strange and rusty in his throat. "Hermione, I'm so sorry." But even as he spoke the words, he could hear Tom's voice in the back of his mind, explaining why apologies were weakness, why sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. The conditioning ran too deep, had been too carefully cultivated over months of patient manipulation. She brought it on herself, Tom's voice whispered. She couldn't leave well enough alone. No, Harry thought desperately. That's not true. She was trying to help. She was trying to protect people. But the voice continued, relentless and reasonable. She was trying to interfere with forces beyond her understanding. This is what happens to people who overreach their station. Harry pressed his palms against his temples, trying to silence the internal argument, but it was too late. Tom's influence had sunk too deep, had become too much a part of Harry's own thought processes to be easily expelled. Even here, standing over the body of his friend, Harry couldn't fully escape the rationalizations that made his actions seem justified. "Harry," the voice came from behind him, soft and uncertain. Harry spun around to find Ron standing in the doorway of the hospital wing, his red hair disheveled and his face pale with exhaustion. "Ron," Harry said, his voice carefully neutral. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same question," Ron replied, stepping into the room. "I come here sometimes, when I can't sleep. I keep thinking maybe she'll wake up, you know. Maybe if I'm here when it happens." Ron's voice trailed off, and Harry saw the pain in his former friend's, face. The guilt and helplessness and desperate need to do something, anything, to make the situation better. "He's weak," Tom's voice whispered. "Look at him, clinging to false hope instead of accepting reality." "He cares about her," Harry argued back. "That's not weakness. That's love." "Love is weakness," Tom replied immediately. "Love makes you vulnerable, makes you easy to manipulate. Look at yourself. You're standing here feeling guilty about something that was necessary, all because you once felt affection for a girl who would have destroyed you without hesitation." "Harry," Ron said, moving closer. "Are you all right? You look—" "I look like what?" Harry asked, genuinely curious what Ron saw when he looked at him now. "Different," Ron said quietly. "Like you're not really here. Like you're somewhere else, entirely." "He sees what you're becoming," Tom observed with satisfaction, "and it frightens him." Harry studied Ron's face, noting the careful way his former friend held himself, the way his hand drifted toward his wand when Harry moved too suddenly. Ron was afraid of him. They all were. And the strangest part was, Harry found he liked it. "Maybe I am somewhere else," Harry said finally. "Maybe the person you thought you knew never really existed." Ron's face crumpled slightly, and Harry felt a familiar spark of cruel satisfaction. It was so easy to hurt people when you stopped caring about the consequences, so simple to reduce them to tears with just a few well-placed words. "That's not true," Ron said desperately. "You're still my best mate, Harry. You're still the same person who saved the Philosopher's Stone, Who what?" Harry interrupted. "Who was grateful for your friendship? Who needed your approval? Who cared what you thought about him?" Each word hit Ron like a physical blow, and Harry watched with detached interest as his former friend's face went through a cycle of hurt, anger, and desperate hope. "Yes," Ron whispered. All of that. You're still that person. No, Harry said, and his voice carried a finality that made Ron flinch. I'm not. That person was weak. That person apologized for having power and tried to make everyone else comfortable with his existence. I'm done being that person. Then who are you now? Ron asked, his voice barely audible. Harry considered the question, thinking about all the conversations he'd had with Tom, all the lessons about power and heritage, and the weakness of sentiment. When he answered, his voice carried a certainty that surprised even him. I'm Slytherin's heir. I'm someone who takes what he wants instead of waiting for it to be given. I'm someone who understands that some people matter and others don't. Ron stared at him in horror. You can't mean that. You can't really believe. Can't I? Harry asked, stepping closer to Ron, noting how his former friend instinctively backed away. Look around you, Ron. Look at Hermione lying there like a statue. Look at how easily everyone abandoned me the moment they learned what I really was. Look at how quickly the adults you trusted revealed their true nature. But that doesn't make it right, Ron said desperately. Just because people failed, you doesn't mean you have to become... Become what? Harry interrupted. Powerful? Independent? Someone who doesn't need approval from people who were never really friends to begin with? It means you don't have to become evil, Ron shouted, his voice echoing in the quiet hospital wing. The word hung in the air between them like a sword. Evil. Such a simple word, such a clear distinction. Once upon a time, Harry would have been horrified by the suggestion that he might be evil. Now he found himself considering it with academic interest. Am I evil? He asked Tom silently. Evil is a word weak people use to describe strength they don't understand, Tom replied immediately. You're not evil, Harry. You're evolved. Maybe I am, Harry said aloud, and saw Ron's face go white with shock. Maybe that's exactly what I've become, and maybe that's exactly what the world needs. No, Ron whispered. Harry, please. I know you're still in there somewhere. The real you, the one who saved my sister from that diary in first year, who faced Voldemort to protect the stone. That person wouldn't hurt innocent students. That person wouldn't... Harry's blood turned to ice. Ron was talking about first year, about events that suddenly seemed to carry new significance. A diary that had possessed Ginny Weasley, that had nearly killed her by draining her life force. The diary, Harry thought with growing horror. Tom's diary. I've been carrying Tom Riddle's diary. Don't, Tom's voice said, urgently in his mind. Don't listen to him. You know the truth about what happened. I told you. But the pieces were clicking together with terrible clarity. Tom Marvolo Riddle, anagrammed to I am Lord Voldemort. The diary that had possessed Ginny. The memory preserved in these pages, growing stronger as Harry confided in it, as Harry gave it more of his thoughts and emotions and energy. You've been feeding off me, Harry realized with sick certainty. Just like you fed off Ginny. I've been helping you, Tom replied, but his voice sounded strained now, less confident. Everything I've taught you, everything I've shown you, it's all been real. It's all been manipulation. Harry, please, don't let him poison your mind against me. You know what we've shared is real. You know I'm the only one who truly understands you. But Harry was already reaching into his bag, pulling out the diary with hands that trembled with rage and self-loathing. How could he have been so stupid? How could he have missed something so obvious? Harry, Ron said uncertainly. What's that? This, Harry said, holding up the diary, is how he's been doing it. This is how he's been controlling the basilisk, manipulating everything that's happened. Ron's eyes widened as he recognized the small black book. That's the diary. The one that possessed Ginny. Harry, you have to get rid of it. You have to. I know what I have to do, Harry said. But even as he spoke the words, he felt Tom's influence pressing against his mind, trying to reassert control. You can't destroy me, Harry. I'm part of you now. I've been part of you for months. Destroy me, and you'll destroy everything you've become. Maybe that's exactly what I want, Harry thought back fiercely. No, Tom replied with absolute certainty. You're stronger than that. You're better than that. Think about what you'll be without me. Powerless, dependent, grateful for scraps of affection from people who see you as nothing more than a useful tool. The words hit Harry like a physical blow because they carried the ring of truth. Without Tom's influence, without the power and certainty that came with embracing his darker nature, what was he? Just another scared boy, desperate to belong, willing to apologize for his very existence. That's right, Tom continued, sensing Harry's hesitation. Without me, you're nothing. Just another victim, another person for stronger wills to manipulate and control. Is that really what you want? Harry stared down at the diary in his hands, feeling the weight of everything he'd become pressing down on him like a physical force. Tom was right. Destroying the diary would mean losing everything he'd gained, returning to the weak, uncertain boy who had been so easy for everyone to use and discard. But it would also mean no more blackouts, no more waking up with blood under his fingernails, and no memory of how it got there. No more standing over petrified friends and feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. Harry, Ron said softly, please. Whatever that thing has been telling you, whatever it's made you think you want, it's not real. The real you wouldn't hurt people. The real you cared about everyone, even people you didn't know. Maybe that was the problem, Harry said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe caring about everyone meant I never really cared about anyone. That's not true, Ron insisted. You saved my life in first year. You saved my sister. I saved people because I was told it was the right thing to do, Harry interrupted. Because I was trying to be what everyone expected me to be. But what if I don't want to be a hero? What if I want to be something else? Exactly, Tom whispered. You don't owe them anything, Harry. Not your gratitude, not your service, certainly not your sacrifice. But even as Tom spoke, Harry found himself looking at Hermione's frozen face, remembering the last conversation they'd tried to have. She'd been trying to warn him about something, trying to tell him about her research. She'd cared about him enough to risk herself investigating the truth, and he'd dismissed her concerns because Tom had taught him that her intelligence was a threat rather than a gift. She tried to save me, Harry realized. Even when I was pushing her away, even when I was becoming something horrible, she was trying to save me. She was trying to control you, Tom corrected immediately. Just like all the others. They want you weak and manageable, not strong and free. But the argument felt hollow now, mechanical. Harry could see through Tom's manipulations, could recognize the careful way every conversation had been steered to isolate him further, to turn him against everyone who might have helped him resist. Ron, Harry said quietly, if I destroy this thing, will you help me? Even after everything I've done, everything I've said. Ron's face lit up with desperate hope. Of course I will. Harry, we'll get through this. We'll fix everything. Hermione will wake up and we'll— Don't, Harry interrupted. Don't promise things you can't deliver. I've hurt people, Ron. I've done things that can't be undone. We'll deal with that when we have to, Ron said firmly. Right now, the important thing is getting that thing away from you. Harry nodded, raising the diary with hands that shook with more than just physical exhaustion. But before he could act, Tom's voice exploded in his mind with desperate fury. You can't! I won't let you throw away everything we've accomplished. I won't let you destroy yourself for the sake of these worthless— The voice cut off abruptly as Harry's vision went grey around the edges. He felt himself swaying, the diary slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers, and distantly heard Ron calling his name. But the sounds seemed to be coming from very far away, muffled as if by thick glass. When Harry's vision cleared, he was no longer in the hospital wing. He was standing in the Chamber of Secrets. The ancient stone walls stretched up into shadow around him, carved with serpents that seemed to writhe and move in the flickering light of torches that had lit themselves without his command. At the far end of the chamber, the massive statue of Salazar Slytherin loomed like a judgment, its eyes fixed on Harry with stony disapproval. And standing before the statue, solid and real and smiling with terrible warmth, was Tom Riddle. Not the teenage memory Harry had seen in visions, but someone older, perhaps 17 or 18, with dark hair and aristocratic features and eyes that held depths of intelligence and cruelty that made Harry's breath catch in his throat. "Hello, Harry," Tom said, his voice carrying easily through the vast chamber. "I was wondering when we'd finally meet properly." Harry tried to speak, tried to move, but found that his body no longer seemed to belong to him. He could only stand there, paralyzed, as Tom approached with fluid grace. "You've been trying to fight me," Tom continued conversationally. "I'm impressed, actually. Most people surrender much earlier in the process. But then, you were always special, weren't you?" "This isn't real," Harry thought desperately. "I'm still in the hospital wing. This is just another vision." "Oh, but it is real," Tom said, apparently able to hear Harry's thoughts. "More real than anything you've experienced in months. You see, Harry, every time you wrote in my diary, every time you shared your thoughts and feelings with me, you gave me a little more of your life force. Just like Ginny Weasley did, though she was much less cooperative about it." Harry tried to step backward, but his feet remained rooted to the stone floor. "I've been growing stronger," Tom explained, circling Harry like a predator studying prey. "Fed by your emotions, your pain, your growing isolation. And now, finally, I'm strong enough to take physical form, strong enough to finish what I started 50 years ago." The diary, Harry managed to think. "Ron will destroy the diary. Without it, you'll—" "The diary?" Tom laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Harry, the diary was just the beginning. I'm inside you now, woven into your thoughts and memories and magical core. Destroying the diary won't destroy me. It will only mean I no longer have to pretend to be your friend." Harry felt something cold and terrible settle in his chest as the full scope of Tom's deception became clear. The diary hadn't just been influencing him. It had been preparing him, hollowing him out, making space for something else to take residence. "You're going to possess me," Harry whispered, the words scraping his throat like broken glass. "Possess you?" Tom looked genuinely offended by the suggestion. "Harry, I'm going to become you. By the time I'm finished, there won't be enough of Harry Potter left to possess. There will only be me, wearing your face and wielding your power." "No," Harry thought with desperate fury. "I won't let you." "You don't have a choice," Tom replied simply. "You never did. From the moment you picked up that diary, your fate was sealed. You've been fighting a battle that was already lost." Tom reached out and placed a hand on Harry's forehead, and immediately Harry felt something vast and cold rushing through his mind, overwriting his memories, his personality, everything that made him who he was. "I have to fight," Harry thought desperately, even as he felt pieces of himself being systematically erased. "I have to—" But the thought dissolved before he could complete it, replaced by Tom's patient voice, explaining why resistance was pointless, why Harry should be grateful for the opportunity to become part of something greater than himself. Harry's last coherent thought, before the darkness closed over him entirely, was a desperate prayer that someone, anyone, would find a way to stop what he had accidentally set in motion. Then Harry Potter ceased to exist, and only Tom Riddle remained, wearing a familiar face and ready to finish what he had started so many years before. In the hospital wing, Ron knelt beside Harry's collapsed form, frantically trying to wake his friend, while the diary lay open beside them, its pages now blank and innocent-looking. But Tom Riddle no longer needed the diary. He had found something much more suitable for his purposes. Chapter 8. The Voice of the Diary. Tom Riddle opened Harry Potter's eyes and smiled. The sensation was intoxicating. Having a physical form again after decades of existing as nothing more than memory and will preserved in ink and parchment. He flexed Harry's fingers experimentally, marveling at the way the muscles responded to his commands, at the steady pulse of blood through veins that were now his to control. The boy's body was young and strong, practically thrumming with magical power that Tom could feel singing through every nerve ending. Perfect, he thought with satisfaction. Absolutely perfect. He was still in the hospital wing, he realized, looking around at the rows of empty beds, illuminated by moonlight streaming through tall windows. Ron Weasley knelt beside him, beside Harry's body, shaking his shoulders and calling his name with increasing desperation. "Harry! Harry, wake up! Come on, mate, talk to me!" Tom almost laughed at the irony. If only the red-haired boy knew that his precious friend was gone, erased so completely that not even a whisper of his consciousness remained. Harry Potter had ceased to exist the moment Tom's will had overwhelmed his own, leaving nothing behind but useful memories and a convenient face for Tom to wear. But those memories were fascinating. Tom found himself sifting through them like a scholar examining ancient texts, discovering new depths to Harry's experiences that the boy himself had never fully understood. The night his parents died, seen now through eyes unclouded by sentiment, how satisfying it was to finally witness his own triumph over James and Lily Potter. Harry's years with the Dursleys, which Tom had used so effectively in his manipulation, but which now revealed even more delicious details of systematic abuse and neglect. And the memories of their conversations through the diary. How naive Harry had been, how eager to believe that someone finally understood him. Tom had played the role of mentor and friend with perfect precision, offering exactly the combination of validation and corruption that the lonely boy had craved. "You deserve better," Tom remembered writing. "You're special, Harry. You're powerful." All true, of course. Harry Potter had been special, special enough to serve as the perfect vessel for Tom's resurrection. And now that resurrection was complete. "Harry, please," Ron was saying, his voice cracking with emotion. "I know you're in there somewhere. Fight it. Fight whatever that thing did to you." Tom decided it was time to end the charade. He allowed Harry's eyes to flutter open, blinking as if coming back to consciousness after a fainting spell. The relief that flooded Ron's face was almost touching in its sincerity. "Ron?" Tom said, using Harry's voice, but modulating it slightly, making it sound weaker, more confused. "What happened? I feel strange." "You collapsed," Ron explained quickly, helping Tom, helping what he thought was Harry. "Sit up. 1 minute you were holding that diary, talking about destroying it, and the next you just dropped. Harry, that thing, whatever it was, it did something to you." "The diary," Tom repeated, looking around as if searching for it. He spotted the black book lying a few feet away, its pages now blank and innocent-looking. How fitting that the instrument of his rebirth should appear so harmless now that its purpose had been served. "It's gone," Ron said, following his gaze. "Whatever was in it, it's gone now. You don't have to worry about it anymore." "Oh, but it's not gone," Tom thought with amusement. "It's right here, wearing your best friend's face and speaking with his voice. I remember," Tom said slowly, injecting just the right note of dawning horror into Harry's features. "Tom Riddle. He was in the diary. He was controlling me, making me do things I never wanted to do." Ron's face went pale. "Tom Riddle. Harry, that name. Do you know who—" "Tom Marvolo Riddle," Tom interrupted, allowing genuine satisfaction to creep into his voice. "I am Lord Voldemort." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Ron's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally dawning horror as the implications sank in. "No," Ron whispered. "That's impossible. You're Harry. You're my best mate. I'm Tom Riddle, Tom said, rising to his feet with fluid grace. I've been Tom Riddle all along, slowly consuming your precious friend, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of him to consume. Ron scrambled backward, his hand going to his wand. But Tom was faster. Harry's magic responded to his will with gratifying eagerness, and Ron's wand flew from his grasp to land in Tom's outstretched palm. Now, Tom said chidingly, examining the wand with academic interest. Willow and unicorn hair, if I'm not mistaken. A loyal wood, but not particularly powerful. Rather like its owner, wouldn't you say? What did you do to him? Ron demanded, his voice shaking with rage and terror. What did you do to Harry? I set him free, Tom replied conversationally. Free from the burden of caring about people who only valued him for what he could do for them. Free from the weight of expectations that were never his to carry. Free from the pain of existing in a world that feared and resented his power. You killed him. I liberated him, Tom corrected gently. Harry Potter was weak, Ron, crippled by sentiment and the desperate need to be loved. I've given him something far more valuable than love. I've given him purpose. Ron's face crumpled with grief and rage. Bring him back. Whatever you did, undo it. Bring him back. There's nothing to bring back, Tom said with something approaching kindness. Harry chose this, you know. Every conversation we shared, every lesson I taught him about the nature of power, he accepted it all willingly. By the end, he was practically begging to be consumed. It wasn't entirely true, of course. Harry had tried to resist at the very end, had attempted to destroy the diary and break free from Tom's influence, but those final moments of defiance were irrelevant compared to the months of careful corruption that had preceded them. Tom had molded Harry's mind with the patience of a master sculptor, and the boy's last-minute attempts at rebellion had been far too little, far too late. You're lying, Ron said desperately. Harry would never choose this. He would never choose you. Wouldn't he? Tom asked, tilting Harry's head in a gesture that was familiar, yet somehow wrong. Think about it, Ron. How long had Harry been pulling away from you? How often had you seen him talking to himself, muttering under his breath, his eyes going distant and cold? When was the last time he seemed genuinely happy to see you? Ron's face went white as he clearly remembered the signs he'd tried so hard to ignore. The way Harry had become increasingly isolated and angry, the cruel things he'd said, the cold satisfaction he'd taken in others' fear. He was fighting it, Ron whispered. He was fighting you. He was embracing me, Tom corrected. Learning to see the world as it truly is, instead of through the rose-colored lens of childish optimism. I taught him that power is the only currency that matters, that sentiment is a weakness to be overcome, that some people matter and others simply don't. Tom began walking slowly around the hospital wing, running Harry's fingers along the beds where the petrified students lay. When he reached Hermione's bed, he stopped and looked down at her frozen form with detached interest. Take Miss Granger here, he continued conversationally. A brilliant girl by all accounts, top of her class, voracious reader, quick to grasp complex magical theory, but also Muggle-born, which means her magic is stolen rather than inherited, a corruption of natural order that weakens the magical world as a whole. You're insane, Ron said, but his voice lacked conviction. I'm realistic, Tom replied. Harry understood that by the end. He saw that preserving magical purity isn't cruelty, it's necessity. The alternative is the slow degradation of everything our ancestors built. Tom reached out and touched Hermione's frozen cheek with Harry's hand, noting with satisfaction how Ron flinched at the gesture. She was getting close to the truth, you know. Her research into basilisks and the Chamber of Secrets was remarkably thorough. A few more days and she would have exposed everything. So you had Harry attack her. I had Harry protect our work, Tom corrected gently. And he did it beautifully, with just enough restraint to avoid killing her while ensuring she could no longer interfere. A perfect balance of power and precision. Ron's hands clenched into fists. She was his friend. She cared about him, tried to help him. She was an obstacle, Tom interrupted, his voice hardening slightly. And obstacles must be removed. Harry learned that lesson well, didn't you, Harry? For a moment, Tom's voice had changed, become slightly higher, more uncertain. Ron's eyes widened with desperate hope. Harry, are you still in there? Tom smiled, but it was Harry's face that spoke, Harry's voice that carried a note of desperate pleading. Ron, help me. He's too strong. I can't fight him anymore. Hold on, Ron said urgently, starting forward. I'll find a way to help you. We'll get Dumbledore or— Dumbledore is gone, Tom said, his own voice reasserting control with casual ease. Removed from the school and stripped of his authority. There's no one coming to help, Ron. No cavalry riding to the rescue. Just you, alone, facing something far beyond your ability to comprehend or defeat. The brief glimpse of Harry's consciousness had been real. A tiny fragment of the boy that Tom had allowed to surface just long enough to give Ron false hope before crushing it again. It was a game he could play for hours, letting Harry's desperate pleas surface just long enough to torment both boys before reasserting complete control. You're a monster, Ron whispered. I'm evolved, Tom replied, and soon the rest of the magical world will understand the difference. Tom began moving toward the door of the hospital wing, and after a moment's hesitation, Ron followed. Not because he wanted to, but because leaving Tom, leaving what had been Harry, alone and unsupervised, was unthinkable. Where are you going? Ron demanded. To finish what I started, Tom said without turning around. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened, but the real work is just beginning. It's time for the magical world to see what true power looks like. They walked through the empty corridors of Hogwarts, their footsteps echoing hollowly in the darkness. The castle felt different to Tom now that he inhabited a physical form again, smaller somehow, more manageable. When he'd been a student here, these walls had seemed infinite, full of secret passages and hidden mysteries. Now he could sense the underlying structure of the building, could feel the ancient magic thrumming through the stone foundations. Harry's memories, Tom realized. 2 years of living in this castle, exploring its secrets, learning its rhythms. How convenient. They passed a group of portraits, whose occupants watched them with obvious unease. News of the recent attacks had spread through the magical paintings, and they recognized Harry Potter, even if they couldn't sense the change in the boy who wore his face. "Young Potter," called a portrait of a stern-looking wizard in medieval robes. "Shouldn't you be in your dormitory? The castle isn't safe after dark." Tom paused, looking up at the painting with interest. "The castle has never been safer," he said with Harry's voice. "At least, not for those who belong here." The portrait's painted features creased with confusion. "I beg your pardon?" "The purification has begun," Tom explained patiently. "Soon, only those with true magical heritage will remain within these walls. The pretenders, the thieves, the corrupted bloodlines, all will be cleansed away." The portrait went pale, understanding enough to be afraid, but not enough to act. Tom smiled and continued walking, leaving the painted wizard to stare after them in horror. "You're going to attack more students," Ron said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to complete Salazar Slytherin's vision," Tom corrected. "The Chamber of Secrets was never meant to be opened just once, you see. It was meant to be the heart of an ongoing process, the systematic removal of those who have no right to magical education." They had reached the entrance to the chamber now, hidden behind Myrtle's bathroom in the abandoned wing of the castle. Tom paused in front of the sink that concealed the entrance, running Harry's fingers over the carved snake that served as a hidden lock. "Open!" he hissed in Parseltongue, and the sink sank smoothly into the floor, revealing the dark tunnel that led down into the chamber's depths. Ron stared at the opening with obvious terror. "You're really going down there." "We're going down there," Tom corrected. "You're coming with me," Ron. After all, someone should witness the dawn of a new age for the magical world. I won't, Ron said, backing away from the entrance. I won't help you hurt more people. Tom sighed with exaggerated patience. You misunderstand. I'm not asking for your help. I'm simply requiring your presence. Before Ron could react, Tom raised Harry's wand and spoke a single word. Imperio. The Imperious curse hit Ron like a physical blow, and Tom watched with satisfaction as the boy's resistance crumbled under the weight of absolute magical compulsion. Ron's face went slack, his eyes becoming glassy and unfocused. Much better, Tom said with approval. Now then, shall we proceed? Ron nodded obediently and followed Tom down into the tunnel without protest. The Imperious curse was one of the unforgivable curses, of course, but Tom had never particularly cared about the Ministry's arbitrary classifications. Power was power, and those who possessed it had every right to use it as they saw fit. The tunnel was exactly as Tom remembered it from his student days, long and dark and filled with the echoes of ancient magic. He'd spent considerable time down here during his 6th year, communing with the basilisk and planning the purification that had been interrupted by that meddling half-blood Hagrid. But this time would be different. This time he had a body that could channel magic properly, a face that no one would suspect, and complete control over the situation. There would be no convenient scapegoats this time, no need to frame innocent students for his crimes. When the purification was complete, everyone would know exactly who had carried it out, and they would thank him for it. The Chamber of Secrets opened before them like a cathedral of shadow and stone. The massive statue of Salazar Slytherin dominated the far end of the chamber, its carved features seeming to shift and move in the flickering torchlight. Tom felt a deep sense of homecoming as he stepped onto the ancient floor, breathing in air that hadn't stirred in decades. "Come to me," he hissed in Parseltongue, his voice echoing through the vast space. The response was immediate. From the depths of the statue's mouth came the sound of something vast moving through stone passages, scales sliding against carved walls. The basilisk emerged slowly, its massive head weaving hypnotically as it tasted the air with a forked tongue longer than a grown man's arm. "Master," the great serpent hissed in the old tongue, "you have returned to us. We have waited so long." "I know," Tom replied in the same language, reaching out to touch the basilisk's massive head with Harry's small hand. "But the waiting is over now. We have work to do." "The young ones who do not belong," the basilisk said, with evident anticipation. "Shall we hunt them down, as in the old days?" "Soon," Tom promised. "But first, we need to ensure there will be no more interruptions, no more meddling from those who would protect the unworthy." Tom turned to where Ron stood under the Imperious curse, his face blank and obedient. The red-haired boy had been Harry's closest friend, his most loyal supporter. It would be fitting if he served as the first offering to the new age that was about to dawn. "Feed," Tom commanded the basilisk. "Begin with this one." The great serpent's head turned toward Ron with lazy interest, its yellow eyes beginning to open. But before the deadly gaze could find its target, something unexpected happened. Tom felt a sudden, violent surge of resistance from somewhere deep inside Harry's consciousness, a fragment of the boy's will that Tom thought he had completely crushed. For just a moment, Harry's voice broke through Tom's control. "No!" Harry screamed with his own lips. "Ron, close your eyes! Don't look at—" Tom reasserted control immediately, cutting off Harry's desperate warning, but the damage was done. Ron, still under the Imperious curse, but apparently retaining enough awareness to respond to direct commands from his friend, squeezed his eyes shut just as the basilisk's deadly gaze swept over him. Impossible, Tom thought with a mixture of rage and grudging admiration. The boy should be completely gone. There should be nothing left of his consciousness. But clearly, some tiny fragment of Harry Potter remained, buried so deep in his own mind that even Tom's thorough consumption hadn't reached it, And that fragment was still fighting, still trying to protect the people Harry had once cared about. Fascinating, Tom decided. Inconvenient, but fascinating. The basilisk, confused by the conflicting commands, had paused in its approach to Ron. Tom could feel its uncertainty through their mental connection, its desire for clear direction about how to proceed. The boy is protected by his closed eyes, the basilisk observed. Shall I strike anyway? My fangs will serve as well as my gaze. Tom considered this. Killing Ron would certainly be satisfying, and it would eliminate one of the few people who might be able to expose what had happened to Harry. But it would also waste an opportunity. Ron Weasley could be useful in other ways, as a witness to spread word of Tom's return, as a means of manipulating others, as bait to draw more victims into the chamber. Not yet, Tom decided. Let him live for now. We have more important work to do. Instead, Tom turned his attention to the deeper purposes of the chamber. This wasn't just Slytherin's monster storage facility. It was a nexus of ancient magic, a place where the boundaries between life and death, between flesh and spirit, grew thin. It was the perfect location for the final phase of his resurrection. Because while Tom now possessed Harry's body, he hadn't yet reclaimed his own magical power in full. He was using Harry's magic, channeling it through Harry's wand, limited by Harry's natural abilities. To truly return to his former strength, he needed to perform a ritual of reclamation, one that would drain the life force from a willing sacrifice, and use it to restore his own magical core to its full potency. And he had the perfect sacrifice in mind. Tom began walking toward the center of the chamber, where ancient runes were carved into the stone floor in complex patterns. These weren't part of the original construction. Tom himself had carved them during his student years, preparing for rituals he'd hoped to perform, but had never had the opportunity to complete. Now, finally, he could finish what he'd started. "Gather the materials," Tom commanded the basilisk in Parseltongue.